Someone screams after getting hurt. Someone cries after being betrayed. But someone else laughs. Not in joy, not in relief, but in that exact moment when another person suffers. This isn't just rare, it's disturbingly common. People laugh at humiliation, at pain, at collapse, sometimes quietly, sometimes explosively. And when asked why, they say, "I don't know," or "it was just funny." And maybe the most unsettling part is sometimes that person is you. The video of someone slipping on ice. The cruel prank that leaves someone panicked, crying. The punchline that mocks someone too awkward to defend themselves. It feels harmless, even enjoyable. But pause, watch your own reaction. The smile forming, the breathless amusement, the pleasure. Where does that come from? It doesn't come from misunderstanding. You recognize the pain, you see it clearly, and still, something inside you twists it into entertainment. The line between pain and pleasure blurs, not just in what we watch, but in what we feel. You laugh, not despite the suffering, but because of it. You can tell yourself it's about detachment, that it's not real to you. But what about when it is? What about the moment you see someone's face break in shame and you feel the warmth of laughter rising in your chest? It isn't abstract, it's right there, and still, you feel it. There's no safe distance in a classroom when a child stumbles over their words and the room explodes in laughter. There's no illusion when a coworker's mistake becomes a running joke for weeks. There's no fiction when a nervous voice breaks during a speech and it's met with smirks instead of silence. In that moment, empathy dissolves. It's not that you don't know they're in pain. You do. You can see the trembling hands, the red face, the downcast eyes, and still something compels you, something automatic, effortless. You laugh or you join in, or you feel that impulse to smile, to share it with others. A small, private thrill. What does it mean when our instinctive reaction to another person's suffering isn't concern, but amusement? Maybe it's about dominance. You laugh because you're not the one suffering, because you're safe, because for just a moment, someone else is lower, smaller, exposed. And your laughter confirms it. Not out loud, not proudly, but quietly, invisibly. You feel it without choosing it. Or maybe it's about relief. The pain didn't fall on you. You escaped, and laughing becomes a ritual, a way of sealing that truth. A nervous system resetting. But that doesn't make it less cruel. It doesn't matter what you believe about yourself. Kind, caring, sensitive. Everyone has laughed this way. Everyone. And every time, something inside us grows more used to it, more numb. You begin to see how fragile empathy is, how easily it gets suspended. In crowds, in jokes, in groups of friends who reward mockery, in moments of tension where laughter becomes permission, an unspoken agreement to ignore someone's dignity for the sake of brief connection. And you learn that cruelty isn't always loud. It's often quiet, social, playful. It doesn't look like violence. It looks like comedy. It sounds like laughter. The crowd laughs at the man who cries in public. The internet piles onto the woman who speaks clumsily. The group mimics the voice of someone who struggles, and no one wants to stop it, because stopping it makes you part of the pain. So instead, you become part of the audience, watching, smiling, saying nothing. You realize that laughter is a kind of signal. It tells others you're not the target, that you're inside the circle, not outside, that you belong, and that makes it dangerous. Because once laughter becomes a survival tool, empathy becomes a threat. Silence becomes weakness, and speaking up becomes social death. so people laugh, even when they don't want to. Even when it makes them feel sick afterward, they laugh because the alternative feels worse. They laugh to protect themselves, to join in, to disappear inside the noise. But what happens afterward? After the room goes quiet, after the video ends, after the person leaves, you feel something else. Guilt, maybe, discomfort, but more often, nothing at all, because the laughter was shared, distributed. No one is to blame. Everyone did it, which means no one has to carry it alone. And yet, it lingers. The knowledge that your laughter had a cost, that someone paid for it with their pain, and that you let them. You might tell yourself you didn't mean it, that it wasn't serious, that they'll be fine. But underneath, there's a quieter truth. You laughed, not because you're cruel, but because cruelty, in that moment, felt easier than compassion. And once you know that, it doesn't go away. You can't unsee it. The part of yourself that enjoys the fall, the mistake, the breakdown, the part that laughs not in malice, but in relief, in fear, in complicity. You start to wonder how many times someone has laughed at you the same way, quietly, comfortably, thoughtlessly. You realize that most people don't hurt others out of hatred. They do it out of momentum, out of habit, out of the strange, invisible comfort of not being the one who's hurting. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Because the most twisted behaviors don't look like evil. They look like fun, like bonding, like nothing at all. Until later, when the silence returns and you hear the echo of your own laughter and realize who it was aimed at, and how little it took to aim it. Imagine someone you care about tells you their partner hits them. Not once, not in passing, but often. You ask why they stay, and they look at you with a mixture of fear and affection, and say, because they love them. This moment is hard to understand. You want to pull them away, show them it's not love, that it's control, but they defend the person who hurts them. They minimize the damage. They take blame that isn't theirs. They protect the abuser from consequences. At first, it seems irrational, almost delusional. But when you look closer, it's more unsettling than that. It isn't that they don't see the abuse. It's that they've come to accept it as normal, sometimes even as deserved. They've been slowly trained to see harm as affection, punishment as love, fear as stability. This doesn't happen all at once. It starts small. A raised voice, a cutting comment, a door slammed too hard, followed by an apology, then a gift, then affection. The cycle repeats, each time slightly worse, slightly more consuming, and over time, the victim stops noticing the pattern. Or if they do, they feel complicit in it. They start believing the abuse says something about them, that they're difficult, that they provoke it. That if they were more careful, more loving, more obedient, it would stop. The abuser doesn't have to lie to them. They do it themselves. This is the trap. It's not just about fear. It's about identity. The victim begins to reshape their sense of self around the abuse. It becomes familiar, predictable, even comforting in its consistency. And so when outsiders express shock or urge escape, it feels like a threat, not to safety, but to the fragile version of reality the victim has built to survive. This defense of the abuser isn't always conscious. Sometimes it's automatic, a reflex built from years of justifying what shouldn't be justified. Other times it's strategic, an attempt to reduce the violence by showing loyalty. A hope that by staying close, they can avoid the worst of it. That if they defend their abuser, maybe the next blow won't land as hard. But sometimes it's not strategic. It's emotional. The victim genuinely feels love, not just fear, not just confusion, but real, aching love. because the same person who causes them pain is also the one who gives them comfort afterward. The person who breaks them down is also the one who builds them back up, just enough to keep them from leaving. It creates a bond that doesn't make sense from the outside, a connection fused through trauma, through survival, a form of attachment so strong it overrides self-preservation. Not because the victim is weak, but because they've been systematically taught to see survival not as escape, but as staying. And what's worse is that society often reinforces this. Victims who stay are judged, dismissed, even blamed. They're asked why they didn't leave sooner, why they didn't fight back, why they still care. As if enduring abuse somehow makes them responsible for it. As if love, once contaminated by harm, should immediately dissolve. But love doesn't dissolve easily. Even when it's toxic, especially when it's toxic, it becomes entangled with fear, hope, memory, obligation. It becomes part of the victim's narrative, and to let go of that love is to admit that the years spent enduring it were not a path to healing, but a descent into harm. That's not an easy truth to accept. So they defend the abuser, not because the abuse is right, but because accepting how wrong it is would mean facing the enormity of their own suffering, the wasted time, the broken self-worth, the betrayal of trust. It would mean seeing clearly something too painful to hold. And yet, sometimes they do see it. They have moments of clarity, sharp and terrifying. But the clarity doesn't always last. It fades under the weight of routine. It gets drowned out by apologies, by temporary peace, by the small moments of warmth that feel like redemption. So the cycle continues. And each time they defend the abuser, it gets harder to imagine life without them, harder to admit the full scale of the damage, harder to separate who they are from what they've endured. Because eventually, the abuse isn't just something that happens to them. It becomes who they are allowed to be. Why would someone confess to a crime they didn't commit? Not under torture, not under threat, just admit it. Sign the paper. Say the words. Let the sentence fall. You want to believe it only happens when someone is broken, manipulated, deceived. What if it happens because in some twisted way it feels easier than the alternative? Imagine you're in an interrogation room. It's cold, sterile. The overhead lights don't flicker. They hum, softly, constantly, like they're watching you. You've been here for hours. You don't remember exactly how long. There's no clock in the room. Across the table, someone's been asking you questions, calmly, but insistently. They say they're just trying to help. They say they know it was an accident. They say people will understand. But their words are beginning to blur together. The same phrases, repeated again and again, until you start to hear them, even when they're not being said. At first you deny it. You explain. You try to clarify. But every answer you give leads to another question. Every explanation makes things worse. The more you talk, the more guilty you sound. And slowly, you feel the ground shifting underneath you. Your memory doesn't feel solid anymore. You're not sure if what you remember actually happened, or if you just want it to have happened that way. They show you photos. They tell you about evidence you didn't know existed. They say your fingerprints were there. Your cell phone pinged nearby. A witness saw someone matching your description. You start to feel like you're drowning in facts that don't match your life. You tell yourself to hold firm, that if you're innocent, the truth will protect you. But the longer it goes on, the more that idea starts to feel like a lie. Because the truth isn't doing anything. It's not helping. It's not setting you free. It's just making everything harder. And then they offer you a way out. Just say you did it. Plead guilty. The charge will be reduced. You'll get time served. You'll be home by the end of the week. No trial, no public shame, no chance of losing everything. In that moment, it doesn't feel like an admission of guilt. It feels like survival. You don't believe the system is fair anymore. You don't believe truth matters. You just want this to end. You want to go home. You want to sleep in your own bed, eat your own food, stop feeling like your entire life is a puzzle with missing pieces. So you sign the paper. You speak the words. You say you did it, even though you didn't. And in that moment, something breaks inside you. Not because you lied, but because it worked. You were innocent. But now, officially, you're not. And everyone around you, your family, your friends, your community, will see the same record, the same confession, the same outcome. To them, the truth has been decided. And you can't take it back. You think it ends there. But it doesn't, because every time you try to move on, something pulls you back. Is look from someone who used to trust you, a job you didn't get, a question you weren't expecting. You start to feel like you're living in someone else's life, a version of yourself shaped by a single decision made under pressure. And here's the part no one tells you. Sometimes you start to believe it yourself. You think back to that night, to the things you said, the things you can't quite remember. You wonder if maybe there's something in you you never understood, something dark, something capable. You think maybe you really did do something terrible. And if you didn't, why did you confess? You start to feel like the version of you that told the truth was the lie, and the version that confessed is the only one that makes sense anymore. That version got you out. That version protected you. That version survived. So maybe you aren't innocent anymore. Not in the way you used to be. Maybe innocence isn't about truth. Maybe it's just about what you're willing to carry. And now you're carrying this. Every day. Quietly. Alone. Imagine being hurt by someone you trusted and feeling closer to them afterward, not just forgiving them, not just understanding them, but actually feeling more bonded, more attached, more dependent. It doesn't make sense. It goes against everything you think you know about relationships. And yet, it happens. Often, you try to explain it to yourself. Maybe they didn't mean to hurt you. Maybe they were just scared or stressed or broken in some way you feel responsible for fixing. You start making excuses. You reframe the pain as a test of your strength or their vulnerability or your shared connection. But beneath all of that, something else is happening. Quietly, deeply. When someone hurts you, they create a rupture, a break in safety. A gap between who you thought they were and who they suddenly are. And in that moment of confusion, you reach out, not away from them, but toward them. Because you're desperate to close the gap, to make sense of the dissonance, to restore the version of the world you believed in before the pain. You need them to explain, to comfort, to repair what they broke. And if they do, even just a little, it creates a strange kind of intimacy. A cycle of harm and healing, pain and comfort. You start to associate them not only with the hurt, but with the relief that follows. And over time, that pattern can feel like closeness, like love, like trust. You begin to believe that surviving the pain together is a kind of bond, that every hurt is just part of a deeper connection, that their cruelty proves how much you care. It becomes easier to reinterpret aggression as passion, control as protection, jealousy as devotion. You start to confuse chaos with meaning, instability with depth, pain with love, and then you realize something else. You start needing the harm, craving it, because without it, the comfort doesn't come, the cycle doesn't complete. Without the rupture, there's no repair, and without the repair, there's no reassurance. You become addicted to the pattern, Not because you enjoy suffering, but because the relief that follows feels like proof that you're wanted, that you're needed, that you're worth returning to. Even worse, the more you tolerate, the more valuable your tolerance feels. You begin to see your endurance as love, your patience as loyalty. You start to believe that staying despite the harm makes you noble, strong, selfless. You take pride in how much you can forgive, how much you can survive, how much you're willing to endure for the sake of the relationship. And slowly, the harm becomes normalized. You stop noticing how much it costs you. You forget what it feels like to be safe, respected, unafraid. You start to measure love by intensity, not by kindness, by how much you feel, not by how well you're treated. You confuse drama with authenticity, suffering with significance. And you don't just do this with partners, you do it with friends, with family, with institutions, with systems that exploit you, manipulate you, harm you, and then offer just enough validation to keep you hooked. You start to feel grateful for crumbs, for apologies that never change behavior, for moments of peace between long stretches of fear. And because you've been conditioned to expect so little, even basic decency feels like a gift. Eventually, the line between harm and love blurs completely. You stop trusting your own reactions. You second-guess your anger. You question your right to feel hurt. You start to believe that maybe you deserved it. Maybe you provoked it. Maybe you're just too sensitive. You internalize the harm. You turn it inward. And you tell yourself that staying is a sign of maturity, not damage. But the most disturbing part isn't what they did to you. It's what you learned to do to yourself in response. How quickly you redefined abuse as affection. How willingly you rewrote reality to protect your need for connection. How easily you abandoned your own boundaries just to feel less alone. And then one day, maybe, you look back and see the pattern clearly. You see how the people who hurt you became the people you clung to. How the pain became the proof of closeness. How the fear became familiar. And you wonder if you've ever really known what love feels like without suffering attached. You start to realize that some of the strongest emotional bonds aren't built on safety or care, but on trauma, on repetition, on confusion, on the mind's desperate attempt to find meaning in chaos. And that maybe the people you felt closest to were the ones who hurt you most. Someone once told you that the best way to understand your enemies is to study them, but no one warned you what happens when that study turns into mimicry. At first, it's harmless. You notice their behaviors, how they speak, how they argue, how they manipulate. You watch them carefully, almost clinically. You believe you're keeping your distance, staying objective. But slowly, without noticing, you start to adopt their methods, not all at once, just small things. A tone, a gesture, a way of dismissing someone, a way of winning. You tell yourself it's strategic, that you're using their tools to defeat them, that you're nothing like them really. But when does imitation stop being a tactic and start becoming your identity? Sometimes you feel disgusted by them. You see their cruelty, their arrogance, their manipulation, and it makes your skin crawl. But then later, when you're frustrated or desperate, you reach for the very same moves. You shut someone down with a comment meant to sting. You lie a little to protect your image. You play dumb to avoid accountability. And you catch yourself, but you don't stop. Because part of you believes it works. You hated how they behaved, but you also saw how it got results. And now, faced with pressure, you want those same results. You want control. You want to stop being the one who always loses. So you copy the thing you hate. There's a bitter irony to it. You became who you despised, not because you admired them, but because you wanted to beat them. You wanted to prove you were better, but to win on their terms, you had to become more like them. And now the line between you and them is blurred. You think back to moments when someone confronted you about your behavior, when they said you were being cold, unfair, manipulative. You felt misunderstood, maybe even hurt. But deep down, you knew what they were talking about. You heard the echo of someone else in your words. Someone you once swore you'd never become. The people you despise are often the ones you think you're above. But over time, they start to live inside you. Not because you respect them, but because their methods seem like shortcuts to power, to protection, to survival. And once you've used those shortcuts, it's hard to walk the long road again. What's more disturbing is how invisible the change can be. No dramatic turning point, just a quiet erosion, a shift in how you justify things, a slow lowering of the bar, until one day someone calls you out, and your first instinct is defensiveness, just like theirs was. And now you see it, you're not reacting like yourself, you're reacting like them. You try to comfort yourself by saying it's temporary, that you'll go back to being better once things calm down. But the truth is, some of those habits have already sunk in. They've become part of how you think, part of how you see people, part of how you protect yourself. Sometimes you even feel proud of it. Proud that you're no longer naive. Proud that you can play the game now. Proud that you're not being taken advantage of. You think that's growth. But is it? Or is it just surrender? You used to hate how they dehumanized others. How they saw people as tools, obstacles, liabilities. But now, you find yourself doing the same. Not openly, just in your head. A colleague becomes a threat. A friend becomes a rival. A loved one becomes a weakness. You say you still care, but you feel that shift inside, a movement toward control, calculation, distance. You start to notice patterns. The people who hurt you all had something in common, a kind of emotional detachment, a way of staying just out of reach. And now, without trying, you've adopted it too. You become harder to read, quicker to cut off, slower to forgive. You say it's about boundaries, but sometimes it's just fear dressed up as strength. And then one day, you see someone else imitating you, picking up on your sarcasm, your deflection, your quiet cruelty. You see them use it the way you used to, and for a moment, you're horrified. Not because of what they did, but because it looked so familiar. It looked like something you would do. You realize then how imitation spreads. Not just upward, from you copying the ones you despise, but outward from others copying you. And now you wonder how far the chain goes. How much of what you hate in the world is something you've helped reinforce, replicate, reward. You used to think the enemy was out there, that you were resisting them, that your resentment was righteous. But now you see something darker, that resentment was a mask, that beneath it was envy. Not of who they were, but of what they got away with, of the power they had, of the freedom to act without shame. And maybe that's the most twisted part. Not that we imitate the people we hate, but that some part of us always wanted to, always admired their shamelessness, their ability to do what we never let ourselves do. And now you're left wondering if you ever truly hated them at all, or if you just hated that you couldn't be like them, until now. Imagine someone mistreats you, not once, not in a moment of anger, but over and over again, small cuts, quiet slights, a look, a silence, a word carefully chosen to hurt. You notice, you feel it, and still, you try to make them like you. You become more accommodating, more careful. You watch what you say. You look for chances to be useful, to show you're kind, generous, harmless. As if with enough proof of your goodness, they'll stop being cruel, but they don't. And you don't stop either. Some part of you is waiting, not for an apology, but for a shift, for something to click, for them to soften, see you, appreciate you, maybe even need you. This doesn't come from weakness. Not exactly. It's something quieter, more compulsive. You don't even realize you're doing it, half the time. The smile after the insult. The helpful gesture after the cold shoulder. You're not pretending to be kind. You are kind, but your kindness isn't free. It's a strategy, an unconscious one, built over years. You believe deep down that if someone is cruel to you, the solution is to be better to them. You believe cruelty is something that can be fixed with goodness, that if someone hurts you, it must be because you haven't shown them enough care. This isn't empathy, it's programming. It starts early, in families where anger is unpredictable, where love feels conditional, where silence feels like punishment. You learn to manage people's moods, not your own. You learn to scan faces for danger and shift your behavior before the blow ever lands. And sometimes being good, being endlessly pleasing, was the only way to feel safe. But here's where it turns against you. That kindness, once protective, becomes compulsive. Automatic. You offer it to everyone, especially to people who don't deserve it, especially to those who hurt you, because part of you still believes, if you just do enough, if you just give enough, you'll finally be treated the way you want to be. And when that doesn't happen, you don't blame them. You blame yourself. You think you failed at being kind enough. What's harder to see is how cruel people recognize this pattern instantly. Not consciously, but they feel it. The way you shift, the way you soothe, they sense that they can hurt you without consequence, that you'll work harder to win their approval, not withdraw it, and they exploit this. Not always viciously, sometimes just instinctively, but always without remorse. They test your boundaries, and you respond by lowering them. They take advantage, and you offer more. And every time you excuse it, every time you frame it as patience or strength or forgiveness, the pattern deepens. What you think of as compassion becomes complicity. What you call loyalty becomes fear. And the worst part is that you still believe you're in control, that you're choosing to stay, that your love is unconditional, that you're the strong one. But really, you're trapped. Not by them, but by your own need to be needed, to be good enough to finally change someone who was never going to change. And this dynamic doesn't end when they leave. You carry it into every new relationship, every friendship, every workplace, looking for people to please, especially the ones who make it hard, especially the ones who remind you of something old and unresolved. You tell yourself it's empathy, or maturity, or just being a bigger person. But what if it's just the only way you know how to exist? What if, without someone to please, you don't know who you are? The idea that kindness could be pathological is difficult to accept. But maybe it's not really kindness. Maybe it's a reflex, a survival strategy, a deeply learned habit of abandoning yourself to earn temporary safety. Because the truth is, kind people don't just attract cruel ones, they train them, reward them, stay loyal to them, hope for them, and suffer under the illusion that love can cure someone who doesn't want to be cured. And the longer you wait, the more you give, the more convinced you become that walking away would make all that sacrifice meaningless. So you stay. And your kindness becomes a prison you built yourself. And maybe you already know this. Maybe you've known it for a long time, but you keep hoping the next gesture will be the one that finally earns their warmth. That this time, your kindness will be enough. It won't be. It never was. Imagine someone who's been locked in a dark cell their entire life. No windows, no clocks, no noise, except the slow rhythm of their own breathing. One day, the door swings open. No guards, no orders, just freedom, and they don't move. This isn't a thought experiment. It's something that happens. Not always in prisons. Sometimes in homes, in relationships, in belief systems. The door opens, but instead of running, the person freezes. There's something strange about liberation. People assume that once you're free, you'll act free, that you'll want it, crave it. But over and over again, people respond to freedom with fear, with confusion, sometimes with violence. It's easy to say this happens because of trauma or learned helplessness or institutional conditioning. And all of those things play a role, but they don't explain the deeper discomfort. The panic that comes not from captivity, but from its absence. When you're told what to do, when to do it, and why, it hurts, but it's simple, it's predictable. Every day is a loop you don't have to think about. Your role is clear. Your choices are limited. There's something terrifyingly safe about that. But when the walls disappear, you're left alone with something else. Responsibility, uncertainty, the pressure to act without being told how, to choose without anyone, to blame if it goes wrong. For some, that burden is heavier than the cage. The scariest part isn't the freedom itself. It's the realization that you don't know who you are without the thing that used to confine you. Your identity was built around resistance, obedience, compliance, survival. Without the system, there's nothing to push against, nothing to define yourself through, just silence. And in that silence, something breaks. You see it in people who leave cults, people who escape abusive families, even people who retire after decades in a strict career. They thought freedom would be relief, but instead it feels like falling, because there's no structure left to hold them up. They panic, not because they've lost control, but because they've just realized they never had it. The rules were a substitute. The orders were a script. Without them, every choice feels dangerous. Every minute feels like a test they were never taught to pass. Some people retreat. They go back to the cage, or they build a new one, something that feels similar enough to make them feel safe again. A rigid job, a rigid belief, a relationship that mirrors the one they escaped. Not because they want to suffer, but because the suffering is familiar. Others lash out. They become erratic, angry, self-destructive. Not because they're evil or unstable, but because they're overwhelmed. Imagine being handed the controls to a machine you don't understand. Every button feels like a mistake. Every decision feels like a trap. Freedom, in theory, is empowering. But in practice, it reveals how unprepared most people are to navigate life without guidance. Not just institutional guidance, emotional guidance. The quiet feeling of being anchored to something, even if it's harmful. That's why people panic when they're freed. Not because they're broken, but because captivity shaped who they are. It gave them a script, a rhythm, a role. Take that away too suddenly, and there's nothing left but noise. Freedom is loud, in a way. Captivity never is. And maybe what scares people most isn't the future. It's the mirror freedom holds up. It shows them what they never became, what they never dared to want, what they spent years avoiding by following the rules, obeying the system, staying in the role. Some people survive captivity by dreaming of escape. Others survive it by convincing themselves it's necessary. But once you're free, both illusions collapse. You realize you don't know what to do with open space. You never learned how to want anything real. You only learned how to endure, so you panic. Not because freedom is wrong, but because it demands a self you haven't built yet. And for a while, all you can feel is the weight of that absence. the quiet horror of finally getting what you thought you wanted and feeling nothing but fear. What if you didn't really want help? Not truly. Not the kind of help that changes things. Not the kind that takes your hand and walks you away from where you are. Maybe what you actually want, what most people want, isn't to be helped. It's to be controlled, not forced, not in a way you can see and fight. Something quieter. Something that tells you exactly who to be, where to go, what to want. Something that organizes the chaos inside you without asking for your permission. Because real help requires change. It forces confrontation. It's uncomfortable. It asks questions you don't want to answer. But control is clean, predictable. It simplifies things. It offers certainty. Even if that certainty is hollow. You tell yourself you want freedom, that you value autonomy. But when given the chance to actually choose, to take responsibility, you freeze. You hesitate. You wait for someone to tell you what the right answer is. And if no one does, you start to fall apart. So you look for rules, for systems, for someone who knows better. You crave structure, not because it helps you grow, but because it relieves you of the burden of deciding. You want control that disguises itself as guidance. You want commands that feel like advice. You accept surveillance because it promises safety. You obey authority because it spares you from uncertainty. You follow routines, rituals, and ideologies, not because they're good or true, but because they quiet the noise in your head. They make you feel like there's a right way to be. You might even tell yourself that you're resisting, that you're thinking for yourself. But notice how often your rebellion still fits within some predefined script. Notice how often your defiance is just a different kind of conformity, handed to you by someone else. Real help disrupts you. It forces awareness. It demands that you face the parts of yourself you've spent years avoiding. Control just smooths those edges, silences those questions, gives you permission to stop looking too closely. You say you want to heal, but healing is painful, it's long, it's uncertain. Control offers you something easier, an identity already formed, a place already assigned, a purpose already written. And all you have to do is step into it and stop thinking. You might feel like you're choosing it, that you're participating willingly, but you're not. You're selecting from a menu that was created to keep you calm, compliant, and numb. The illusion of choice is enough to keep you from noticing how little agency you really have. Even in your most private moments, you replicate this pattern. You criticize yourself using voices that aren't yours. You discipline your thoughts according to rules you never consciously chose. You seek productivity over peace, achievement over self-understanding, not because it helps, but because it keeps you busy. It keeps you controlled. You fear losing control, but what you actually fear is the absence of it. The wide open space of true freedom. The kind that offers no guarantees, no guidance, and no story to follow. The kind that forces you to face your own uncertainty without anything to hide behind. You've learned to associate help with intrusion, with judgment, with failure. But control, especially soft, invisible control, feels safe. It feels deserved. It feels earned. And so you gravitate toward people who dominate subtly, institutions that organize without asking, ideas that give you a role, a task, a reason, because anything is better than staring into the blankness of your own independence. Even your suffering becomes familiar, structured, contained. You understand how to function inside it. You know the patterns, you know the lines. Real help would disrupt that. It would dismantle the framework you've built to survive. And you don't want that. Not really. You say you want to be free, but the truth is harder. You want to be told who you are. You want your limits defined for you. You want someone to decide what's enough, what's too much, what's acceptable. You want to be kept in place. Because if no one controls you, you'll have to face the fact that you don't know what to do, that you never did. That underneath all your choices and accomplishments is a quiet, persistent confusion. A fear of being unshaped, undefined, alone. So maybe the truth is this: we ask for help because we want to feel seen, but we submit to control because we want to feel safe. And between being seen and being safe, most of us choose safety, every time, even if it costs us everything else. Imagine you're standing at the edge of something better, not perfect, not impossible, just better. A chance, a door half open, and yet, instead of walking through it, you turn back toward the thing that hurt you, back toward the thing that's always hurt you. You know it won't change. You know how it plays out, exactly how it plays out. The same silence, the same withdrawal, the same cycle, pain, apology, a quiet return to normal, and then the slow creep of discomfort again. But at least you know it. At least it's familiar. That's the trap, isn't it? Not that we love the pain, not exactly, but that we trust it. We trust what we've already survived. We trust what we've already felt. Because new hope, real hope, is dangerous. It demands something. It asks you to believe in a future you haven't felt yet. It asks you to imagine being okay, and that's a risk some people can't afford to take. Because if you hope, and it fails, the pain is worse. It's new, it's raw, you weren't prepared for it. You hadn't built your armor yet, but with familiar pain there's no surprise. You've already shaped your life around it. You've already folded yourself into its contours. So when a better path appears, one that asks you to grow, to move, to change, it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like betrayal, like disloyalty to the version of you that survived everything before. And what if the new path isn't real? What if it's a lie? What if it promises more than it gives? Then not only are you hurt, you're humiliated. Not only do you fall, but you fall from hope. And there's no pain quite like that. So instead, you choose what you know. You stay where it's dark, but predictable. You hold on to routines, relationships, thoughts, even if they're hurting you. Even if they're killing you slowly. Because at least they're consistent. At least they don't pretend to be anything else. It's easy to judge this from the outside. To say, why don't they just leave? Why don't they change? But when you're inside it, the logic breaks. You don't ask what's best, you ask what's safest. And safety, to your nervous system, to your memory, to your history, looks like the thing you already know how to survive. Even if that thing is loneliness, even if it's mistreatment, even if it's self-loathing. And the more time passes, the more the pain feels like part of you, like it belongs, like it's who you are. And any version of life without it starts to feel foreign, artificial, unreachable. That's why people stay. That's why they go back. Not because they're weak, not because they don't want happiness, but because hope feels like stepping into thin air. Pain, at least, is solid ground. You start telling yourself stories to make it make sense. That it's not so bad, that it's your fault, that you just have to be better, quieter, more forgiving. You call it love, you call it loyalty, you call it coping. But all of it, every justification, is rooted in the same fear that something new might not be better. That the devil you know is safer than the unknown. You can't control. It doesn't matter how many times you get hurt. The body adapts. The mind builds narratives. You find patterns. You memorize them. And once a pattern is memorized, it becomes easier to follow than to break. So you stay. And sometimes the world praises you for it. For being patient. for being understanding, for enduring. No one sees that what you're really doing is giving up, quietly, slowly, in small ways, until the hope you once had becomes a kind of phantom, something you remember wanting, but no longer reach for, and eventually you forget how to want anything else. Even when a better life is placed right in front of you, you don't recognize it. It feels like a trick, like bait. You look for the catch, and if you don't find one, you create one. Because the alternative, accepting that safety, kindness, respect could be real, means admitting you've stayed in pain for no reason, that all the suffering you tolerated wasn't noble, it was unnecessary. And that's a kind of grief most people can't face. So they go back, again and again, not because they like the pain, but because they've made peace with it, because they trust it, because it feels like home. And maybe the saddest part is, eventually, even the people offering something better stop trying. Not out of cruelty, out of exhaustion, out of watching someone choose harm with their eyes wide open. And you're left with what you always had. The familiar ache, the quiet suffering, the lie you whisper to yourself every night before you sleep, that at least this is better than being disappointed again. Because sometimes people don't fear pain. They fear the hope that something else might exist, something they might lose, something that might hurt in a new, unbearable way. So they stay where it's cold, but known, where it's lonely, but predictable, where the pain has a name and a shape and a rhythm they trust more than they trust their own longing to escape it. There's something hard to look at in the way a person clings to someone who hurt them, not in spite of the harm, but because of it. You might imagine that pain drives people away, that betrayal creates distance, that once someone breaks you, the natural response is escape, protection, anger. But that's not always what happens. Sometimes it does the opposite. It creates a strange kind of attachment, something deeper than affection, more tangled than love. You've seen it before. The child who defends a cruel parent, the partner who can't leave an abusive relationship, the friend who stays loyal to someone who humiliates them. It doesn't make sense from the outside. It looks like weakness, like blindness. But if you look closely, something else begins to appear. When someone breaks you, really breaks you, they become part of your internal structure. Their words, their moods, their judgments, they stop being external. They start living inside your head. You learn to anticipate their reactions. You learn to move around them, adjust to them, quiet yourself to avoid setting them off. Eventually, it stops feeling like adaptation. It starts to feel like reality. The more unpredictable the person, the more tightly you orient yourself around them. Your emotional survival depends on their approval. You feel safest not when they are kind, but when you can predict their cruelty. Kindness becomes suspicious. Cruelty becomes familiar. And slowly your loyalty isn't based on love. It's based on the terror of losing the map you've drawn around their behavior. In this state, love isn't about care or connection. It becomes vigilance, hyper-awareness. You spend your time watching for signs, reading the air, trying to stay one step ahead of the next punishment. And when they finally show you a moment of softness, a small gesture, a kind word, it doesn't feel minor. It feels like oxygen. You cling to it. You replay it. You forgive everything for that single moment. Not because it balances the pain, but because the contrast makes the relief addictive. It's not that you don't know you're being hurt. It's that the occasional release from pain feels indistinguishable from love. And over time, that confusion becomes permanent. Love and fear blur. Hurt and affection merge. You start to believe that suffering is the price of intimacy, that safety is suspicious, that kindness without tension feels empty. What's left is a loyalty that looks irrational, but inside, it feels like survival. Leaving would mean facing something worse than pain. It would mean facing disorientation, the loss of the person who shaped your emotional world, even if they filled it with fear. Without them, you don't just feel abandoned, you feel lost, unstructured, like nothing is real, like you no longer know who you are, without the person who taught you how to exist around their damage. This is why people stay, not because they're weak, but because breaking someone is a way of binding them. Pain reorganizes the nervous system. Predictable cruelty becomes the only kind of stability they know. And once that association is locked in place, freedom feels like chaos, while control, even painful control, feels like love. Even science can't fully explain this. We can name it: trauma bonding, intermittent reinforcement, attachment conditioning. But naming doesn't capture the internal logic of it. It doesn't explain why, even when someone sees the pattern, they can't leave it. It doesn't explain the hollow panic that comes with separation, the emptiness that follows release, the desperate hunger to return to what hurts, just to feel anchored again. And this doesn't just happen in extreme cases. It happens quietly, subtly, in homes that seem normal, in relationships that look fine from the outside. It hides beneath jokes, roles, routines. It happens when someone learns early that love always comes at a cost, that peace is always temporary, that attention is always earned through pain. So later, when they find themselves with someone who breaks them, it doesn't feel wrong. They don't stay because they can't see the damage. They stay because the damage makes sense. They stay because part of them still believes that if they can finally earn the affection of the one who hurts them, it will undo all the pain. That this time, the love will be real. That this time, there'll be enough. But they never are. And the more they try, the deeper the bond becomes, until pain becomes proof of love. And leaving feels like betrayal, not of the abuser, but of themselves. Because if they leave, they'll have to face the truth they've spent years avoiding, that the love they clung to was never real, that the person they trusted was never safe, that the life they built around their pain was always a cage. And sometimes that truth hurts more than staying ever could. A woman walks into a courtroom. She's been accused of a violent crime. No witnesses, no video, no confession, just her face. That's all you see, and before she says a word, something happens. You decide, you feel it. Trust, doubt, suspicion, sympathy. You look at her and think you're just observing, but your brain has already judged. Not her actions, not her story, her face. You don't remember choosing to do this. It happens in milliseconds. Her eyes remind you of someone. Her expression triggers a feeling, a flash of discomfort, or maybe calm. And just like that, you've formed a verdict. She hasn't spoken yet. She hasn't explained. But inside, you've already started leaning one way. Now imagine it's a man this time. Older, weathered, with a scar near his eye. He walks in slowly, and something in your chest tightens. Maybe it's the way he frowns, or the way his posture slouches forward. You try to stay neutral, but your brain is faster than your will, faster than fairness, faster than truth. You're no longer asking, did he do it? You're wondering how he did it. Because something about his face makes guilt feel easier to imagine. We like to believe we think in words, that our opinions are shaped by logic, explanation, evidence. But long before we hear an argument, we're reacting to the person making it, to their eyes, their shape, their voice. And we think we're being reasonable. We think we're above that, but we're not. Not really. This isn't about beauty or ugliness. It's about familiarity, about symmetry, about how certain features are unconsciously linked in your mind with safety or danger. There's a name for it. It's called the face inference effect. But you don't need the term, you felt it. In job interviews, on dates, while scrolling through mugshots or reading a headline next to a photograph. You think you're evaluating the story, but mostly you're evaluating the face. This happens even when you try to resist, even when you know it's irrational. You can meet someone who says everything right, but if their face unsettles you, some part of you stays alert, on edge, waiting for confirmation of the feeling you already have. And if you're given none, your mind still fills the gap. You decide the person is hiding something. You imagine flaws, because the brain would rather invent reasons than admit it, made a decision without logic. Think about how this shapes justice, or trust, or love. How often do we believe someone because they look like someone we once believed? How often do we doubt because of a face that doesn't sit right with us? Not wrong, just unfamiliar, or cold, or sharp. And then we justify that discomfort with a narrative. We don't say their face made me anxious. We say, I just got a weird vibe. But the vibe came from bone structure, from muscle movement, from skin tone and spacing. It came from features you couldn't name, even if you tried. And it shaped your reaction before you even heard the person's voice. Now take this further. Consider politics, the candidates you favor, the ones you mistrust. Go back to the first time you saw their faces, without knowing anything else. Were you drawn to one more than the other? Did one face seem more confident, more moral, more human? And now ask yourself, did your beliefs follow the facts, or did they follow the face? There's a kind of helplessness in this. You don't want it to be true. You want to believe you listen, evaluate, discern. But your mind has shortcuts, and it takes them constantly, because it's faster, easier, safer. Judging faces is one of the oldest instincts we have. Babies do it. Animals do it. It's primitive, it's wired in, and it's rarely accurate. But it feels accurate. That's the trap. It feels like a gut instinct. It feels like wisdom. But it's just your mind trying to predict behavior based on shape and symmetry, and echoes of past impressions. It's trying to keep you safe, even if that safety comes at the cost of truth. And now you begin to wonder, how many people have you misjudged because of this? How many chances withheld? How many accusations made? How many moments where you thought you were being fair, but were really just responding to a face your brain didn't like? It's not just other people. Think about how you see yourself. The way your own face shapes your beliefs about who you are, how lovable you might be, how trustworthy. Your mirror doesn't just reflect your appearance. It reflects back the assumptions others have made about you. The ways you've been treated, the reactions you've received. Your own self-concept is tangled up with the faces you've seen reacting to yours. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. That this bias isn't just something you project outward, it's something you absorb inward. You live inside it, you make choices within it, and you never even knew it was there. Because before anyone speaks, before any words are exchanged, the judgment has already happened. Quietly, instantly, unconsciously. And long after the words are forgotten, the face still lingers. Not in memory, in feeling. In a place beyond language, where reason can't reach. Who decides what someone deserves? Not in theory, but when it's real, when a person is clearly struggling, visibly, painfully, falling behind. Why does that provoke such quiet satisfaction in the people around them? Why does weakness feel so punishable? Watch how people react when someone loses their job, fails an exam, makes a mistake in public, struggles with addiction, poverty, weight, illness. There's often a flicker of sympathy, but just beneath it, something colder, something quieter, something that looks a lot like contempt. It's not just cruelty. It's not even always conscious. But the moment someone falters, the world seems to shift its weight against them. People speak more harshly, help less, blame more. The struggling person becomes less likable, less deserving, less human. Their failure starts to feel like evidence of who they really are. And once that shift happens, punishment begins to feel justified. Not legal punishment, not always, but social punishment. Distance, disdain, a kind of quiet exile. You stop seeing them as unlucky and start seeing them as weak and weakness. In this strange unspoken logic, starts to feel like a crime. You can see it everywhere. In schools, children who struggle academically are ridiculed, not supported. At work, people underperforming are pushed out, not pulled in. Even in families, the sibling who needs the most help often receives the least, as if needing help is proof that you don't deserve it. This isn't a cultural problem. It's deeper than that. It's built into how people see fairness. There's a deep, powerful bias called the just world hypothesis. It's the belief that people get what they deserve, that life sorts itself out, that suffering happens to bad people, and success comes to the good. It's comforting. It makes the world feel ordered, safe, predictable. But it's also false. People suffer for reasons they don't control. Systems fail them. Accidents destroy them. Biology betrays them. Still, when someone falls, it feels easier, safer to assume it was their fault. To believe that deep down they earned their suffering. Because if you admit that people suffer for no good reason, then you have to admit that you could be next. That your safety is fragile. That your success might not be deserved either. And most people can't face that. So instead, they tell themselves stories. The addict had no discipline. The poor person is lazy. The depressed person is negative. The anxious person overreacts. These stories don't match the truth, but they make punishment feel fair, and the punishment doesn't stop at judgment. It extends into policy, into healthcare, employment, housing, justice. People who are already struggling are given more barriers, fewer options, stricter rules. They're tested, watched, questioned, denied, as if their suffering needs to be earned all over again. Even the systems meant to help are built on distrust, as if the greatest threat isn't the pain someone's in, but the possibility that they might not be suffering enough to deserve relief. And if they don't recover quickly, if they keep struggling, the judgment turns to disgust. You've had your chance. You've used up your sympathy. Now you're just choosing this. And because they're still struggling, they must not want to change. They must be manipulating, lying, weak. It becomes recursive. You're punished for struggling. Then you're punished more because the punishment hasn't fixed you. And the longer you suffer, the more you're blamed for your suffering. Until eventually, no one remembers that you needed help at all. They just see failure. And failure, in this quiet, twisted logic, deserves to be punished. This creates a cycle that few people escape. Not because they don't try, but because every part of the world is now built to make their attempts harder. The job application that asks why there's a gap in your resume. The landlord who won't rent to someone with a low credit score. The doctor who sees your history and dismisses your pain. The friend who stops replying because your sadness has lasted too long. They don't even have to say anything. Their punishment is subtle. A tone, a delay, a look. But over time, it compounds until the struggling person starts to believe it too. That they deserve this. That they're broken. That they're shameful. And maybe that's the most disturbing part. Not that people punish those who struggle, but that the people being punished start to agree. They stop asking for help. They stop explaining. They stop expecting anything but more punishment, and they quietly accept it. Because by now, they've been taught that this is all their fault. And the people around them keep watching, silently convinced that this outcome is fair, that the world is working as it should. Because if it isn't, then we're all vulnerable. Then struggle could mean nothing. Then punishment might be cruelty, not justice. Then safety might be luck, not virtue. And most people would rather punish the vulnerable than admit that. You see someone, and for reasons you can't explain, you instantly dislike them. They haven't spoken. They haven't hurt you. They've done nothing wrong, and yet something about them irritates you, quietly, subtly, completely. You don't say it out loud. You don't even admit it to yourself. But the feeling is there, unmistakable and unshakable. It doesn't feel rational. It isn't about their actions. It's something about their presence. Something in the way they hold themselves, how they react, the expressions they make. You try to brush it off, but the discomfort lingers. Later, without warning, you realize something unsettling. The traits you dislike in them. You've seen them before, not in strangers, in yourself. A particular insecurity, a defensive way of talking, the tendency to over-explain, a stiffness in posture when anxious. These tiny, familiar patterns, they mirror your own, and that's when it becomes harder to ignore. Because now it isn't just dislike, it's aversion. You flinch internally, watching them exhibit behaviors you've spent years trying to suppress or deny. And somewhere in your mind, a quiet thought takes shape. You're not really reacting to them. You're reacting to the version of yourself they reveal. The one you try to keep hidden. The one you hoped no one else would notice. This isn't hatred based on difference. It's hatred based on recognition. We tell ourselves we hate what we don't understand. But often the opposite is true. What repels us most is what we understand too well. You see their fear of not being taken seriously, because you've felt that same fear. You hear the way they overcompensate, and it reminds you of times you did the same. Their desperation to be liked, their defensiveness, their forced confidence. It echoes your own. So you start to distance yourself. You convince yourself they're annoying, fake, arrogant, weak. But deep down, you're not angry at them. You're angry that they're exposing something fragile inside you. You're angry that they aren't better at hiding it than you are. Because if you can see it so clearly in them, maybe others can see it in you too. That's the fear, isn't it? That your flaws aren't as invisible as you pretend. That the parts of yourself you thought were buried are, in fact, transparent. So instead of confronting that fear, you direct your discomfort outward. You criticize them, dismiss them, reject them. But it's never about them. It's a self-rejection disguised as judgment. You look for reasons to disapprove. You notice their tone, their mannerisms, their social awkwardness. You exaggerate their flaws in your mind. And in doing so, you create distance, not just from them, but from the part of yourself they reflect. It's a defense mechanism, a way to protect the story you tell yourself about who you are. You say you're not like them. You say you've grown past that. But the more you insist on the difference, the more you reveal how much it still lives inside you. Because real growth doesn't come with disgust. It comes with recognition. It comes with compassion. And if the sight of someone else's insecurity makes you angry, that's not evidence of strength. That's evidence of how close your own insecurity still is to the surface. The hate is a mirror. You just don't want to look. And maybe that's why certain people bother you more than others. Not because they're worse, but because they're more familiar. They walk like you did before you learned how to mask it. They speak with the same fear you once tried to hide. They joke the way you used to, hoping to be liked. And every time they do, it forces you to remember. You tell yourself you've moved on, that you've changed. But the disgust proves otherwise. If you had truly healed, you wouldn't need to push them away. You wouldn't need to hate them. You'd see the pain, the awkwardness, the struggle, and instead of anger, you'd feel understanding. But you don't. Because healing hasn't happened yet. It's only been buried, hidden beneath layers of control, self-discipline, and emotional distance. And when someone shows up who hasn't learned to hide it yet, it threatens everything you've constructed. That's the most disturbing part. Not just that you hate them, but that you need to. Because if you didn't hate them, you'd have to face the version of yourself you're still trying to forget. And so you keep finding reasons. Keep pointing to their behavior. Keep pretending your reaction is logical. But underneath the truth lingers. You don't hate them for being different. You hate them for being the same. A woman collapses on the train. Her body goes still, her breathing shallow. There are 20 people in the car. No one moves. You wait. You assume someone else will step in. Someone with more knowledge, more confidence, more authority. But seconds pass, then minutes. And the silence stretches. It's not that you don't care. You do. You feel it. The unease, the concern, the quiet tension in your chest, but your body doesn't move. You glance at the others, they're glancing too. Eyes flickering, waiting, watching. No one speaks. You think if someone starts helping, I'll help too. If someone kneels, I'll follow. If someone calls for assistance, I'll support them. But no one does. The longer the inaction lasts, the heavier it becomes, not just hers, yours. Later when it's over, you'll tell yourself there was nothing you could do, that you didn't want to get in the way, that you assumed help was already coming. You'll repeat the phrases to yourself until they feel like memory. But deep down, you'll know the truth. It wasn't confusion that stopped you. It wasn't fear of doing harm. It was the presence of others, the diffusion of responsibility, the quiet, unspoken permission to stay still. This isn't unique to you. It happens everywhere. In crowds, in emergencies, in moments of crisis. The more people there are, the less likely anyone is to act. It's called the bystander effect. A name that makes it sound like a quirk of social psychology. But it's more than that. It's something darker. It reveals something uncomfortable about how we relate to each other, how quickly we disown responsibility when it's shared, how easily we become invisible, even to ourselves, in a group. You imagine that emergencies bring out our best, that in the face of danger, we rise to the occasion. But that's not what usually happens. In real life, danger often renders us passive. We become spectators, witnesses, strangers to our own impulses. And there's something almost mechanical about it. A hidden calculation. If no one else is moving, maybe there's nothing to worry about. If everyone is calm, maybe it's safe to be calm too. We mistake stillness for information. We absorb the silence of others as reassurance. But what if everyone is thinking the same thing? What if everyone is waiting for the same signal, and no one is willing to make it? Then the moment slips away. The chance to act disappears. And all that remains is a lingering sense of guilt, thin, quiet, but permanent. You imagine that if you were alone with someone in trouble, you'd help immediately. And maybe you would. Because in solitude, the moral burden is yours alone. But among others, that burden dissolves. You wait for someone else to take it from you. Sometimes, even when someone finally does act, the rest still hang back, watching, recording, commenting. We've developed habits of observation, that feel like participation, but they're not. They're just another form of distance. And maybe that's the core of it. Distance. Not physical, but emotional, psychological. The space between what we feel and what we're willing to do. Because when we act, we risk being wrong. We risk embarrassment. We risk being the only one. And that fear, that quiet, social fear, is often stronger than compassion. It's not that we don't care. It's that we don't want to care alone. And so we wait. We look to others. We hope someone else will carry the weight. And when they don't, we quietly accept it. Even when someone suffers, even when someone dies, you wonder what kind of world this creates. A world where the presence of others makes action less likely, where moral responsibility evaporates in crowds, where emergencies become performances of silence. And it's not just strangers. Sometimes even among people who know each other, friends, co-workers, neighbors, we hesitate. The roles shift. Familiarity turns cold. Eyes avoid each other. No one wants to be the first to step forward. There's a kind of psychological fog that settles over groups, a paralysis that spreads, subtle and invisible. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels normal, ordinary, safe. And that's the most disturbing part, how normal it feels, how easy it is to become part of the silence, how quickly we adjust to inaction. You'd like to think that next time you'd be different, that you'd move first, that you'd speak, intervene, act. But can you really be sure? Because when the moment comes, it won't feel like a grand decision. It won't feel like a test. It will feel like nothing. A quiet tension, a second of uncertainty, a brief glance around the room. And if no one else is moving, will you? Or will you stand there, like the others, like all of us have at some point, hoping someone else will make the choice that you're too afraid to make? Because in emergencies, we don't become heroes, we become strangers. Someone helps you when you didn't ask for help, not just in passing, but deeply, generously. They go out of their way. They expect nothing in return. And instead of feeling grateful, you freeze, you tense up. Something feels wrong. You tell yourself it's suspicion, that maybe they want something later, that no one is ever that kind without a reason. But even when it's clear they don't want anything, when they walk away without asking, you still feel uneasy. It lingers. You replay it in your head, the look on their face, the softness of their voice, the way they treated you like you mattered, without making you prove it, and you feel exposed, like they saw something in you you didn't want seen. There's a part of you that wants to reject it, push it away, sabotage it. You find yourself downplaying their gesture, mocking it in your mind, twisting it into something transactional or naive. Because if it really was pure, then what does that say about you? You've spent so long measuring yourself by effort, by pain, by what you've endured or overcome. So when someone offers you kindness without struggle, without cost, without reason, you feel unworthy of it. Not because you don't want it, but because you don't believe you've earned it. And if you accept something you didn't earn, what does that make you? The kindness begins to feel like an accusation, a quiet suggestion that maybe you've been wrong about yourself, that maybe you didn't need to suffer as much as you did, that maybe someone could have loved you all along without conditions, without tests, without proving your worth again and again. That possibility is harder to face than any rejection. You begin to wonder what it means about your past. If this kindness is possible now, was it possible back then? Were there moments you missed, people you pushed away, safety you didn't believe in? Did you carry pain longer than you had to? So the kindness doesn't feel good. It feels like an undoing. It threatens the story you've told about your life. And to accept it fully would mean changing that story. It would mean admitting that you didn't have to be so hard on yourself, that your suffering wasn't always necessary. And that's a kind of grief. Not for what happened, but for what didn't. For the years you spent waiting to be worthy of something that was never supposed to be earned. There's also fear, not just of being seen, but of what happens next. If someone is kind to you now, what happens when they see who you really are? When they realize you didn't deserve it? You brace for the moment they change their mind. You try to preempt it by rejecting them first, or proving your value as fast as possible. You don't want to owe anyone, especially not emotionally, because owing means risk. Kindness means debt, and a debt you can't repay in equal measure feels like weakness. So you harden, you pull back, you start looking for flaws in the other person. Any excuse to diminish the power of their gesture, because if they're flawed, then maybe their kindness doesn't count. Maybe you're safe again. But the truth is, you're not rejecting them. You're rejecting the part of yourself that believes you aren't lovable unless you earn it. You're protecting the part of you that still thinks love must be bought through performance, perfection, and pain. And deep down, you know this. You feel it every time someone is kind to you, and your first instinct is to apologize, to explain, to justify why you don't deserve it. As if unearned kindness is something to be ashamed of. But it's not, it's just unfamiliar. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that love had rules, that kindness had to be deserved, that safety came with strings. And even though those rules hurt you, they made sense. They gave you structure, control, a way to predict what people would give and what they'd take. Unearned kindness doesn't follow those rules. It doesn't make sense. And that makes it terrifying. It's not that you fear kindness itself. It's that you fear what it means. If kindness is real, if it's possible to be loved without condition, if it's possible to receive care without proving your worth. Because if that's true, then everything you built to survive becomes unnecessary. And then who are you? You fear kindness when it feels unearned, not because it's wrong, but because it asks you to become someone who no longer needs to suffer. And you're not sure who that person is, or if they'd even recognize you. He murdered 4 women, strangled them, buried their bodies in shallow woods, and returned days later to look at the graves. When they caught him, he cried. He said he was sorry. He told the court he couldn't explain why he did it. And when his voice broke and his shoulders shook, the people watching felt something unexpected. Not disgust, not rage, but a flicker of sympathy. They didn't want to, but they did. Why? Why does remorse, even when it comes from someone who's done something unspeakable, seem to soften everything? Why do we recoil at the crime, but pause when the criminal cries? There's a pattern we don't talk about, a strange and silent instinct. When someone causes harm, we search for signs of regret, and when we find them, we begin to let go, not completely, but enough to start changing the story, enough to begin telling ourselves they didn't mean it, that they're not like the others, that maybe somewhere underneath it all, there's a person worth saving. We want to believe that evil isn't fixed, that even the worst people can feel pain, because pain in some twisted way makes them human again. A tear turns a monster into a tragedy. It reframes the violence. It makes it feel less like hatred and more like suffering spilling over. But there's something disturbing beneath that. Because if a killer cries and we forgive him, what are we really responding to? His remorse or our need to feel morally superior for recognizing it? Are we showing mercy or just avoiding the discomfort of hating someone who can still feel. We say we value accountability, but what we really value is the performance of accountability, not change, not repair, just the visible expression of regret. The tear, the tremble, the choked apology. That's all it takes to start reshaping the narrative. All it takes to make a brutal act feel somehow understandable. You might think this only applies to rare, extreme cases. But look closer. It happens everywhere. A parent hits their child, then cries. The child forgives them. A partner cheats, breaks down sobbing, says it meant nothing. The other partner holds them while they cry. A leader lies, gets caught, shows emotion on camera. Their approval ratings recover. We are conditioned, it seems, to interpret pain as evidence of goodness. If they hurt, they must have a conscience. If they cry, they must care. But what if that's not true? What if the crying is instinct, not morality? What if the pain they feel is about consequences, not the harm they caused? There's a deeper contradiction here. We fear people who don't feel guilt. We label them psychopaths, monsters, threats. But the ones who cry, who confess, who say they're broken, we begin to excuse. We begin to explain. We begin to rehabilitate, not based on the damage they did, but on the emotions they can display afterward. It's almost as if we're more comforted by their suffering than we are disturbed by their victims. As if a killer who cries is somehow safer than a killer who doesn't. Even though the bodies are the same, the violence is the same. Only the performance has changed. And it is a performance, sometimes, not always. But enough to make you wonder how many of the tears we've seen were real, and how many were strategic, calculated, necessary for survival. You'll never know, that's the problem. Remorse isn't measurable, it isn't verifiable, it's emotional smoke. And yet we treat it like evidence. We treat it like proof. So what does that say about us? Maybe it means we want redemption stories more than we want justice. Maybe it means we're desperate to believe that no one is beyond repair, that even the worst acts can be undone if the person responsible cries hard enough. Or maybe it means something darker. Maybe it means we only punish people who scare us. And the moment they cry, they stop being scary. They become pitiful, weak, manageable. And we don't hate people who seem weak. We pity them, even if they've ruined lives. So we forgive monsters, not because they deserve it, but because we need to see them as something less than monstrous. We need to believe there's still a boundary between good and evil, and that remorse is the line that separates them. But what if it's not? What if remorse is just another mask? What if the people who do terrible things and cry afterward are not remorseful, not reformed, but simply rehearsed? Then the tears mean nothing, and our forgiveness means even less. What if the worst rules are the ones we don't even notice anymore? Not because they're hidden, but because they've been around so long that we've stopped questioning them. Rules that once might have seemed bizarre, even cruel, but now feel natural, expected, normal. It starts small, a policy at work that feels unfair, a tradition that excludes, a belief that punishes those who think differently. At first, there's pushback. People complain, they resist, they try to change things, but when that fails, the complaints grow quieter. The resistance fades. And eventually, everyone starts acting like this is just the way things are. And once that happens, the rule becomes something else. Not a choice, not even a directive. It becomes background, structure, a part of how life works, and the longer it lasts, the more sacred it feels. The more absurd it would seem to question it now. Because time doesn't just normalize behavior, it sanctifies it. It cloaks it in legitimacy. The fact that something has lasted becomes its own proof that it should last. We tell ourselves there must be a reason for it. that it can't be arbitrary, that if something was truly wrong, someone would have stopped it by now. But history doesn't work that way, and neither do people. The most enduring systems of cruelty often began as experiments, accidents, reactions to fear or control or power. But once they're in place long enough, something changes. We forget that they were ever created. We start to believe they were discovered. Laws that punish the poor, rituals that demean, practices that divide people into classes or castes or roles they can never escape. All of these started somewhere. Someone made them up, but the moment they lasted long enough, they became something more. They became rules, and rules, once they're old enough, feel impossible to disobey. You can see it in the workplace, in schools, in families. Someone is told to do something that makes no sense, but they do it anyway because that's how it's always been done. They don't want to cause trouble. They don't want to be the one who resists. So they follow the rule, even when it hurts them, even when it hurts others, and then they pass it down. They enforce it on the next person. And slowly, without anyone meaning to, the rule survives. Not because it's useful, not because it's right, but because it's old. And something strange happens the longer it lasts. People stop noticing that it's even a rule. They start to believe it's just part of the world. Like gravity, like weather. They stop looking for reasons. They stop imagining alternatives. They obey worse rules simply because those rules have lasted. You might think you wouldn't fall for that. You'd notice if a rule was unjust. You'd question it. You'd resist. But would you think about the rules you follow every day without thinking? The ones that shape how you speak, how you dress, how you treat other people. The ones that make you feel ashamed when you disobey, even if no one's watching. Where did those come from? When did you decide they were right, or did you just absorb them over time? And what happens when you're punished for breaking one? Maybe not with violence, maybe just with silence. A cold look, a loss of opportunity, a subtle exclusion. It doesn't take much to remind you that you stepped outside the boundary, so you step back in, quietly, carefully, and the rule survives another day. You might even start enforcing it yourself. Not because you believe in it, but because it's easier, because it keeps the peace, because it spares you the discomfort of standing out. But every time that happens, the rule grows stronger, not because it deserves to, but because it's being obeyed. Its age becomes its power. Its persistence becomes its justification. And soon, the cruelty isn't coming from the top anymore. It's being maintained from below, by people who were once victims of it, who now see it as normal, as necessary. As part of the order of things, you obey the rule. You teach others to obey it. And without realizing it, you become one of its protectors. That's how the worst rules last. Not through force, through participation, through repetition, through time. And the longer they last, the harder it becomes to even see them. Until one day, they vanish so deeply into the structure of your life, that questioning them feels like questioning the ground beneath your feet. And maybe by then, it's too late. Imagine someone you know, a friend, a colleague, someone from school. They've always had potential, but they make reckless decisions. They never follow through. They sabotage their own chances. You see them chasing impossible dreams or walking straight into failure again and again. And still, a part of you envies them. Not because they're succeeding, not because they're doing something right, but because they don't seem afraid. You wouldn't trade lives with them. You tell yourself that. You remind yourself how much more responsible you are, how much more secure, how much more grounded. But still, when you see them leap headfirst into chaos, some quiet voice inside you feels something like longing. They aren't trapped the way you are. You've built your life carefully. You've made the smart choices, the safe ones. You've done what was expected. But with that safety comes pressure, inertia, the weight of maintaining control. You wake up each day with responsibilities. You think about consequences. You protect your future like it's fragile glass. And they don't. They risk everything. They dream in ways you no longer let yourself dream. You see them throw themselves at impossible goals with reckless certainty, and even though you know they're going to fall, something about it captivates you. It stings. It makes you question whether you ever really chose this life, or whether it was just the path with the fewest risks. You know what's going to happen to them. They'll fail. They'll collapse under the weight of their own delusion. They'll hit the bottom hard. You can see it before it happens. You predict it with disturbing accuracy. But you keep watching, and when they fall, you don't feel satisfied. You don't feel vindicated. You feel hollow, because part of you was hoping they'd make it. Part of you was desperate to see someone like them break through, just to prove that freedom is still possible. That maybe all your careful planning wasn't the only way. That maybe there's another kind of life, one that isn't built around control and avoidance. You don't envy their future. You envy their refusal to be afraid of it. But then the thought gets darker. What if you want them to fail, not just expect it, but want it? Because if they succeed, it makes your own life harder to justify. If they succeed, it reveals something terrifying, that maybe you gave up too soon. That maybe your fears weren't wisdom, just limitations you mistook for insight. So you sit there, watching someone pursue a dream you've secretly buried, and you want them to crash. Not because you hate them, but because you can't bear what their success would say about you. You need them to fail, so you can keep believing you made the right choice. And that's the most painful part, that your desire for their failure isn't about them at all. It's about protecting your own story, preserving the lie that you never wanted more, that you never wished you were braver, that you never looked at their reckless optimism and felt a flash of shame for how small your own hopes have become. You start to see how fragile your contentment really is, how easily it cracks under comparison. Not comparison to someone more successful, but to someone less afraid. To someone who seems free in a way you forgot was possible. And now you wonder how many people around you are watching you the same way. How many people quietly hope you fail, not because they dislike you, but because your success would threaten the story they tell themselves. How many smiles hide envy? How much support is just tolerance? How many of your victories create silent resentment in the people closest to you? You start to understand something uncomfortable, that envy isn't about wanting what others have. It's about what their choices reveal about your own. It's about what you've repressed, denied, avoided. Envy lives in the gap between who you are and who you were too afraid to be. And when you feel that quiet pull, watching someone you know will fail, it isn't cruelty. It's grief. For the version of yourself you let go of, for the paths you left unexplored, for the risks you were too careful to take. You don't envy their failure, you envy their ability to face it. And the more you understand that, the harder it becomes to look away. Imagine walking into a room and no one looks up. No greeting, no acknowledgement, no smile. You sit down quietly. You stay. It doesn't make sense at first. You would expect the coldness to drive you away, but it doesn't. You linger longer. You wait. You watch. You try to understand what just happened, why it happened to you. Something begins to shift, not in them, but in you. You start adjusting your behavior. More careful, more watchful, more agreeable. You wonder if you did something wrong. You try not to speak too loudly. You try not to take up too much space. You find yourself hoping, silently, that someone will turn and say something, anything, but they don't. And still, you stay. Most people assume attention is what we seek, praise, affection, inclusion. But sometimes what we really seek is explanation, and in the absence of one, we stay trapped in the loop of trying to earn it, trying to decode silence, trying to win back what was never given in the first place. This is where it becomes strange. The more indifferent someone is to you, the more invested you become in their opinion. Not because they deserve it, but because your mind begins to assign meaning to the absence. You assume the rejection must be earned, and so you try to unearn it. You interpret every small gesture as a clue. A glance becomes significant. A shrug becomes ambiguous. And still, you wait. You begin to feel like walking away would mean accepting something unbearable that you weren't worth noticing to begin with. The longer you're ignored, the more powerful the other person becomes. Not because they did anything, but because your mind turned them into a mystery you now have to solve. It's a strange, inverted bond. They don't acknowledge you, and somehow that makes them more important. Their approval becomes scarce, and scarcity makes things valuable, even when the thing itself has no inherent worth. This is why people stay in relationships where they're neglected, why employees stay in jobs where they're overlooked, why children keep trying to earn the affection of distant parents, not because they're happy, but because they're stuck inside a quiet, invisible contest, one they can't seem to walk away from. And here's the contradiction. The more you try, the less you receive. The more effort you give, the more indifferent the other becomes. You start to believe you just haven't done enough, haven't waited long enough, haven't earned it yet. But that moment never arrives. There's something especially disorienting about being ignored. It doesn't feel like an insult. It doesn't feel like abuse. It's nothing, and nothing is harder to fight. It leaves no evidence, no conflict, no closure, just confusion. Just the aching sense that maybe somehow you're invisible. And that's why you stay. Because leaving feels like confirming that invisibility, like agreeing with their silence, like admitting defeat in a battle you were never invited to fight. But what if their silence isn't about you at all? What if their indifference has nothing to do with your worth? It doesn't matter, because by then you've already built the story. You've already filled the gaps with meaning, and now it's not about them. It's about your need to rewrite the ending. Even if they say nothing, you keep hoping that someday something will change. That silence will crack. That absence will turn to recognition. That staying will prove you deserved more. But it never does, and still you stay. Quiet, patient, slowly disappearing into someone else's indifference. Because being ignored doesn't push you away. It pulls you in, and you don't even realize how long you've been waiting until you forget what it was you were waiting for. Imagine a person who doesn't see you. Not really. They smile sometimes, maybe even talk to you, but they never reach for you. They don't ask how you're doing when it matters. They don't think about you late at night. You are not a priority to them, and yet your mind keeps returning to them. Over and over, as if their absence matters more than anyone's presence. You try to explain it to yourself. Maybe you admire them. Maybe you're drawn to their confidence, their mystery, their warmth. But if you were honest, you'd admit none of those things are real. They aren't warm. They aren't kind. They aren't interested. You just think they might be. You cling to fragments. A look, a word, a moment that could mean something, if only it meant what you want it to. There are people who would love you back. People who'd hold you, listen to you, stay. But you overlook them. Not because they're unworthy, but because their affection is too easy, too available. You crave something that resists you. something that withholds, something that forces you to earn it, even when there's nothing to earn. This isn't conscious. You don't wake up and choose it, but you feel it deeply. The thrill of uncertainty, the pull of what you can't quite have, the way rejection makes attention feel sacred, and the more they ignore you, the more important they become. It's not love, it's not even attraction. It's a psychological trap, and you keep falling for it. Maybe it started early. Maybe you learned, without realizing, that love was something unstable, something you had to chase. Maybe the people who first taught you about love gave it inconsistently, praising you one day, criticizing you the next. And now you mistake anxiety for affection. You confuse tension with meaning. You feel alive in the pursuit, not the connection. And so you search for people who don't quite care, who don't respond, who don't stay. Because that's the pattern your mind understands. Predictability feels dull. Security feels fake. You tell yourself you're drawn to mystery, to passion, but really you're addicted to hope. The hope that maybe this time will be different. That maybe this person will finally see you, finally choose you, finally love you back. But they don't, and they won't. Because people who love inconsistently rarely change. They pull close when it suits them, then vanish when it doesn't, and you forgive them, again and again. Not because they deserve it, but because it feels worse to let go. Letting go means admitting they were never really yours to begin with. So you stay, quietly. Hopefully. You interpret their silence as shyness, their absence as busyness, their coldness as depth. You rewrite their indifference as complexity. You romanticize their neglect because it's easier than facing the truth that someone you care about doesn't care about you, that they see you and still choose to keep their distance. And this isn't rare, it's common. It happens every day, in millions of quiet moments. People longing for someone who never thinks about them. People pouring energy into relationships that don't exist. People making excuses for behavior that would be intolerable if it came from anyone else. Not because they're weak, but because they're hopeful, because they still believe love can be earned. If they just try hard enough, if they just wait long enough. But here's the cruelest part. The more you love someone who doesn't love you, the less you love yourself. Every unanswered message, every ignored invitation, every forgotten moment becomes a quiet confirmation that you're not enough. You internalize their neglect. You start to believe you deserve it. That if you were better, they'd care. That if you were more attractive, more interesting, more anything, they'd stay. And slowly, without realizing it, you start disappearing. You minimize your needs. You mute your feelings. You accept less and less and less. Until you forget what love is supposed to feel like. Until pain feels normal. Until longing becomes your only form of connection. Why does this happen? Why do we do it? Science doesn't really know. There are theories, attachment styles, reward systems, trauma bonding, but none of them fully explain it. None of them can capture the quiet ache of wanting someone who doesn't want you, or the deeper ache of knowing you'll keep wanting them anyway. Maybe the answer isn't scientific. Maybe it's existential. Maybe we're all just trying to fix something that broke long ago, recreate the pain that shaped us, rewrite the story so it ends differently, so we can finally feel like we're worthy of being loved, even by someone who doesn't. But it never ends differently. Not really, because love isn't something you should have to convince someone to give. It's not a prize. It's not a negotiation. And every time you chase someone who doesn't care, you teach yourself that your value depends on their attention, that your worth rises and falls based on someone else's willingness to see you. And that's the real danger, not the heartbreak, not the rejection, but the slow erosion of your sense of self. The way unreturned love doesn't just hurt, it rewrites you, quietly, permanently, until you can't tell the difference between affection and absence. And maybe deep down that's why it feels so familiar, so strangely comforting. Because even as it hurts, it lets you stay in a role you know well. The one who waits, the one who tries, the one who almost gets chosen, but never quite does. Imagine walking into a room full of people. You don't know them, they don't know you. But within seconds, you sense it. The tension, the sideways glances, the quiet withdrawal. You don't belong here. And somehow, they've already decided you shouldn't. You haven't done anything wrong. You haven't said a word. And yet, something about you doesn't fit. Maybe it's your clothes, your posture, your silence. Maybe it's nothing at all. But the moment has already turned. You're not one of them. And they feel it. Worse, they trust it. We like to think we're rational, that we judge others based on their actions, their values, their choices. But something deeper happens first. Something faster, before thought, before reason. We feel who belongs, then we feel who doesn't. And when someone doesn't belong, we recoil, we turn, we exclude. This instinct is ancient, older than language, older than culture. It's survival logic written into the nervous system. When groups are small and threats are constant, trust to be quick, unforgiving, absolute. An outsider might be a danger. So our ancestors learned to sense difference and to punish it fast. But that instinct never went away. It lives quietly inside us, masked by manners, policies, beliefs. You don't think you're excluding anyone. You don't think you're cruel, but pay attention. Notice how your body tightens when someone talks differently. How your mind searches for reasons to distrust them. How you feel safer when everyone in the room is like you. It's not just you, it's all of us. We gather in circles and we draw invisible lines around them. We build belonging on exclusion. Every us needs a them. Every group strengthens by deciding who doesn't qualify. The outsider isn't just different, they're disruptive. Their presence threatens the fragile harmony we've constructed. And so we reject them. Not always violently, often just with silence, distance, neglect. You'd like to think your judgments are fair, that you give people chances. But how often do you really listen to someone who makes you uncomfortable? How long do you stay open before closing off? How quickly do you look away, dismiss, move on? Most of this happens quietly, beneath awareness. That's what makes it so dangerous. You don't need to believe someone is bad to treat them as less. You just need to feel they're not one of you. And that's enough. Enough to ignore them. Enough to deny them. Enough to let harm happen and not intervene. Even worse, we rarely question these reactions. Because when others agree, it doesn't feel wrong. It feels right. Consensus becomes comfort. We confuse collective instinct for moral truth. If everyone shuns the outsider, their exclusion starts to feel justified, even inevitable. Sometimes the outsider is labeled as strange, sometimes as wrong, sometimes as dangerous. But the label is always just a justification. The rejection came first, the reasons come after, and the outsider feels it, even if they don't understand it. They notice the tone shift, the lost eye contact, the empty space where warmth should be. They adapt, they shrink. They try to blend in, but the damage is already done. Belonging isn't something you earn, it's something you're granted, or not. Now consider what this means when the outsider isn't just a stranger, when it's someone with less power, a minority, a refugee, a disabled person, a trans person, someone whose presence challenges the group's comfort, not through action, but through existence. You tell yourself you're tolerant, inclusive. You believe in equality, but your instincts don't ask your permission. They move first, and they turn, slowly, steadily, away. This turning happens everywhere, in workplaces, in schools, in families, in friendships, and no one needs to say anything cruel. All that's needed is withdrawal, the quiet exit, the shrinking warmth, the way a room rearranges itself around difference, without ever naming it. We think prejudice looks like hatred, but most of the time it looks like indifference, like looking past someone, not at them, like assuming incompetence, like failing to follow up, like always forgetting to invite, like seeing their discomfort and doing nothing. And maybe what's most unsettling is how good it feels to be on the inside, to belong, to sense the approval, the safety, the sameness. That pleasure isn't neutral, it's built on exclusion. It depends on someone else being kept outside. You might think this is just how people are, that it's natural, unchangeable. But that thought itself is part of the instinct. It protects itself by hiding under normalcy. And the longer you go without questioning it, the more deeply it defines you. Because eventually, someone turns on you. Maybe you say the wrong thing, dress the wrong way, stand out just a little too much. And the room shifts. The warmth fades. The silence grows. And you realize that belonging was always conditional. The outsider never chose to be different. The group chose to make difference matter. And no matter how kind you think you are, no matter how fair or thoughtful, that same choice waits quietly inside you, waiting to turn, without warning, without guilt. Imagine a person keeps coming back to someone who hurts them, over and over again. Not because they're weak, not because they don't know better, but because something in them has grown attached to the pain. At first, it's confusing. You see them suffer, you see the damage, and you wonder why they don't walk away, why they keep reaching out to the source of their wounds, as if healing might come from the same place that broke them. You tell yourself it must be fear, or habit, or shame. But sometimes it's something deeper than any of those. Sometimes the pain itself becomes familiar, becomes safe, becomes a kind of home. If you've been hurt long enough, deeply enough, part of you starts to build around that pain. You learn to expect it, to manage it, to live inside it. And then, without noticing, you start needing it. Because without it, you wouldn't know who you are anymore. This is the trap. When someone makes you feel small, ashamed, unwanted, and then gives you just enough warmth to keep you hoping, it creates a pattern that's hard to break. You start to believe that the pain is the price of love, that the fear is part of being close, that you don't deserve anything gentler, safer, easier. And when someone else comes along, someone kind, patient, consistent, you don't feel drawn to them. You might even feel uncomfortable, bored, suspicious, because they don't activate that part of you that's always preparing for the next hit, the next silence, the next withdrawal. They don't make you feel the adrenaline of trying to be good enough, fast enough, careful enough. So you go back to what hurts, because it feels like love, because it feels like home, because your nervous system recognizes it as normal. Even when you know it's killing you, and sometimes it's not even a person you return to. Sometimes it's a thought, a belief, a story you've told yourself for years, that you're not worthy, that you're broken, that you have to suffer to matter. You carry that story like armor, even when it cuts into your skin, because the pain of that belief is still easier than the uncertainty of letting it go. What would be left of you if you stopped hurting? What would fill the space where the suffering used to live? These questions are terrifying, because healing isn't just about feeling better. It's about becoming someone new, someone unfamiliar, someone who doesn't need the pain to feel real. And that change, even when it's good, can feel unbearable. So you stay. You cling to the old wounds. You revisit the people who opened them. You try to prove your worth to someone who never saw it. You beg for closure from someone who can only give you silence. You keep hoping that this time, if you try hard enough, they'll finally give you what you need. But they won't. Not because you're unlovable, not because you're broken, but because they are the wrong source. They were never capable of giving you safety, only the illusion of it. Only enough to keep you hoping, and somewhere inside you know that. But the part of you that still believes pain is love doesn't care. It wants the pattern. It wants the cycle. It wants to return to the familiar wound again and again, because that feels like home, even when it hurts, even when it kills you slowly, even when every part of you is begging to be free. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all, that the thing we most want to escape is the very thing we keep choosing. Not because we don't see the harm, but because it's the only version of love we've ever known. And sometimes we'd rather keep hurting than face the terrifying silence of something different, something unfamiliar, something real. Because the pain, at least, is predictable. And letting go of it means letting go of everything we used to be. Imagine discovering that the opinion you defend most passionately isn't actually yours, that the certainty you feel isn't rooted in truth, but in something murkier, that the reasons you believe aren't the real reasons at all. You've probably felt it before. Someone challenges your view, and instead of calmly considering it, your body reacts. You tighten. You grow defensive. You search for the right words, not to learn, but to win. You don't stop to ask why it matters so much. You don't wonder what you're really protecting. But maybe it isn't the idea itself. Maybe it's something inside you. Something older, quieter, and harder to see. Most people assume they know what they believe, that their convictions are deliberate, reasoned, chosen. But what if they're not? What if the beliefs you cling to are just stories you've built, stories meant to hide something deeper, something you don't want to face? It's not that you lie to others, it's that you lie to yourself, subtly, slowly, without even realizing it. Think of a belief you hold strongly, maybe about politics, or success, or love. Something you'd defend if asked. Now ask yourself where it came from. Who told you it was true? Who did you need to be when you first started believing it? What did it protect you from? Sometimes opinions are armor, not thoughts, but shields. They protect you from being questioned, from feeling uncertain, from re-experiencing shame. And if someone threatens that shield, you don't respond with curiosity, you respond with fear. Because they're not just challenging an idea, they're pressing on a scar, and so you hide, not from them, from yourself. You say things that sound reasonable, you say them with conviction, but you avoid the quiet voice beneath it. The one that's afraid, the one that remembers. You might tell yourself you believe in hard work, that success is earned. But maybe that belief started when you needed to justify being neglected. Maybe it was easier to say, people get what they deserve, than to face the fact that you were left behind for reasons that had nothing to do with you. Or maybe you say you value independence, that you don't need anyone. But maybe that belief took root the day someone you trusted disappeared. And now you can't admit that you still want connection, because that would mean reopening the door to being abandoned again. None of this is conscious. That's what makes it so difficult. You think you're being honest. You think you've figured yourself out. But parts of your mind are still hidden from view, actively keeping you in the dark. And the more you insist you see clearly, the more those hidden parts tighten their grip. There's a kind of safety in self-deception. If you never question your beliefs, you never have to confront the possibility that they were built on fear. You never have to reckon with how much of your identity is just a defense mechanism. But deep down, you feel the dissonance. You catch yourself reacting too strongly to something small. You feel exhausted after certain arguments, not because the logic was complicated, but because the emotions weren't. They were old and unresolved. And here's the most unsettling part. You don't just deceive yourself once. You do it over and over, constantly. Every day, in small ways, you make choices and then backfill the logic afterward. You act on instinct and then invent reasons that make it sound deliberate. You convince yourself you're being rational, when really you're avoiding pain. And the more intelligent you are, the better you become at building these internal stories. You're not escaping the truth because you're weak. You're escaping it because you're clever. Your mind is good at protecting itself. Too good. Even when the cracks start to show, you smooth them over. You tell yourself you're being open-minded, that you've considered all sides, but you never linger in the discomfort long enough to uncover what's actually there. Because discomfort feels like danger, and part of you still believes that truth will hurt more than lies. So you keep hiding, not out of malice, not out of pride, but out of fear. Because facing what you truly believe, why you believe it, means re-entering moments you've spent your whole life avoiding. It means giving up the illusion that you are who you pretend to be. And maybe that's the most terrifying realization of all, that you're not fighting to protect your beliefs. You're fighting to protect the fragile identity you've built around them. And that, without those stories, you might not know who you are. Because once you admit that your opinions might not be yours, you have to ask what else isn't. And that question doesn't just unsettle you, it undoes you. Quietly, completely, irreversibly. Do you remember the first person who made you feel small? Not because they hurt you, not because they shouted or punished or humiliated you, but because they looked at you with cold, wordless judgment, and you wanted nothing more than to be good in their eyes. That quiet desperation, that ache for approval from someone who frightened you. It never quite leaves. You might think fear creates distance, that when someone intimidates you, your instinct is to retreat, protect yourself, build walls. But often, the opposite happens. You move closer, you try harder, you adapt to please them. You change your words, your tone, your posture, hoping to win something that feels like safety, even if it's only the absence of harm. It's not always conscious. You might tell yourself you're just being respectful, just avoiding conflict. You might even believe you admire them. But beneath that surface is something darker, a need to be accepted by the very person who makes you feel most unsafe. Because fear doesn't just repel, it binds. It creates a strange form of dependence, where you measure your worth through the eyes of someone who could hurt you. Their opinion becomes a mirror you can't stop looking into, even if it distorts everything you are. Sometimes it's a parent, other times a teacher, a boss, a partner, someone with power, someone unpredictable, someone whose disappointment feels heavier than their anger. You begin to craft yourself around their preferences. You anticipate what will make them approve of you, what words soothe, what behaviors avoid rejection. You become fluent in their moods, always adjusting, always calculating. And the more they withhold approval, the harder you work, not because you believe you're wrong, but because deep down you fear that their disapproval reveals some hidden truth about you. That you are small, that you are not enough, that their coldness is deserved. You might think it's about control, that you're just trying to manage the situation, survive it. But over time, it stops being about survival and becomes something more insidious. You start needing them to like you. You're needing them to see you as good, competent, worthy. The very person who intimidates you becomes the judge of your value, and that's the trap. Because if they ever do offer approval, it feels like relief, like forgiveness, like love. Not because it is, but because your nervous system, conditioned by fear, interprets that approval as safety. It becomes addictive. You chase it, even when it costs you your dignity. But here's the part no one likes to admit. Sometimes we seek approval from those we fear, not because we want to connection, but because we want to win. We want to conquer the fear. We want to make them need us. We want to reverse the power without realizing we've already submitted to it. We don't seek their approval because we trust them. We seek it because it means we've survived them. And sometimes it goes deeper. Sometimes the fear itself becomes familiar. You start to confuse tension with importance. You start to believe that people who scare you must be right, must be competent, must be better than you. And so you shape yourself around them, not just to avoid pain, but because part of you believes that if they accept you, it will mean you've earned your place. Even when the fear fades, the behavior doesn't. You still find yourself drawn to people who unsettle you, trying to impress them. You still feel a quiet panic when they disapprove. You still believe their validation matters more than others. You never ask why. But ask yourself now, why do you care what they think? What do you believe their approval will prove? That you're strong, that you're not who they made you feel like you were, that you've finally overcome the fear? Or is it something simpler, that part of you still feels small and is desperate for the person who made you feel that way to tell you you're not? That's the cruelty of it. Even when you grow stronger, more capable, more confident, some part of you still waits for their approval, still craves it like a wound craving closure. You carry that person inside you. You carry their silence. You carry the hope that one day you'll be good enough in their eyes to finally feel whole. But that day doesn't come, because people who use fear to shape others rarely offer approval freely. That's how the control works. That's how the bond deepens. That's why it lasts. And maybe that's the hardest truth, that the fear wasn't just a phase, it was a template. One you kept following long after the threat was gone. One that still shapes who you trust, who you serve, who you let define you. Because fear doesn't just shape what you run from. It shapes what you run toward. And sometimes the person you most want to impress is the one you should have walked away from long ago. Imagine a moment where everything finally works, where the hard part is over. The money is enough, the stress is gone, the problem is solved. For a few seconds, it feels like peace. But then something strange happens. You get restless. You start checking for what's next. You notice the silence, and it feels wrong, too quiet, too still. You open your phone, you check your messages. You invent new tasks, new goals, new anxieties to chase. You tell yourself it's just ambition or discipline or drive. But maybe that's not it. Maybe you're not chasing peace. Maybe you're addicted to the noise. It doesn't make sense at first. Struggle is painful. It exhausts you, drains you, tears at your nerves. You say you want it to stop. You say you're working for the reward, the outcome, the end. But when you finally get there, you don't rest. You sabotage, you panic, you begin again. Maybe this is why your victories never feel satisfying, why your happiness fades so quickly. Because struggle, not success, is what you've trained yourself to need. The effort becomes its own reward, not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. And familiarity feels safe, even when it's miserable. You start to realize you've built your identity around difficulty. Who are you if you're not overcoming something? What do you talk about if nothing is wrong? What do you wake up for if there's nothing left to fix? You become anxious without conflict, suspicious of ease. You interpret peace as laziness, joy as weakness, rest as a threat. So you keep the pressure on. You create urgency. You stir up problems. Not consciously, but you do it anyway. You delay finishing things. You find reasons to worry. You raise the bar. And when something finally feels calm, you convince yourself you're slipping, falling behind, losing your edge. As if suffering is the only proof that you're still in control. But that control is fragile, because deep down you don't know what to do without the struggle. You say you want peace, but when it comes, you recoil. Not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't match the rhythm of your nervous system anymore. You've spent so long in fight mode that stillness feels like a threat, like something must be wrong if there's nothing to survive. Your brain starts searching for what's missing, what's broken, what needs to be fixed, and it will always find something. You don't even need real problems anymore. You manufacture stress out of ordinary days. A quiet afternoon becomes a crisis of meaning. A small decision becomes unbearable pressure. You pick fights in your head. You replay old regrets. You imagine worst-case scenarios just to feel something. It's not that you like suffering. It's that suffering became your baseline. Your body remembers how to function there. The chemicals, the urgency, the focus. It feels like home and comfort. Without those signals, starts to feel numb or worse, like you're disappearing. You begin to realize this isn't about motivation or hustle or productivity. It's about addiction, not to results, but to the experience of trying, of striving, of hurting. The reward is just an excuse to keep the game going. So when things finally get better, you don't celebrate. You look for the next mountain, the next wound, the next fire to put out. Not because you want to suffer, but because you don't know how to stop. Even therapy, healing, growth, they all become battlegrounds. New ways to struggle, new ways to prove you're still fighting, still working, still worthy. You never actually arrive. You just move the finish line again and again until even hope feels exhausting, because peace requires surrender. And surrender feels like death when your whole identity is built around effort. That's the real fear, isn't it? Not failure, not pain, but losing the struggle itself. The thing that's been keeping you alive, keeping you alert, keeping you certain of who you are. If you let go of that, what's left? What if there's no goal, no tension, no grand thing to overcome? What if your only task is to just be here, without needing to be better, faster, stronger? Would you know how, or would you find a way to ruin it? Would you chase new problems, invent new missions, resurrect old enemies, just to feel the tension again, just to feel alive? Because maybe it's not the struggle you fear, maybe it's who you'd become without it. Imagine being thirsty, desperately, painfully thirsty. Then picture yourself holding a glass of clean, cold water. You lift it to your lips and pour it out. Not by accident. You do it on purpose, and the worst part is you don't even know why. You needed that water. You still do. But something inside you rejected it the moment it was within reach. You told yourself it wasn't the right glass, or it wasn't cold enough, or that you didn't deserve it. So you threw it away. Then you sat there, dry-mouthed and miserable, pretending you didn't need it in the first place. This isn't about water, of course. It's about what you do when comfort appears, when help arrives, when love, care, stability, whatever you've been craving, finally steps toward you, calmly, with open hands. And instead of stepping forward to meet it, you step back. Or worse, You ruin it. You test it, twist it, push it until it breaks. You sabotage what you need most, and you do it so quietly you almost believe it was never real to begin with. It's easy to blame fear. Fear of getting hurt. Fear of needing something that might leave. But fear is only part of it. There's something deeper, something more disturbing. It's the sense that you're not allowed to have what you want. That if you reach out and take it, something terrible will happen. That receiving good things means betraying some silent rule you learned long ago, without ever realizing it. Maybe you grew up believing closeness leads to pain, that vulnerability is dangerous, that depending on anyone is foolish, and even now, even when your life has changed, that script still runs in the background. You say you want connection, peace, love, but when it shows up, you flinch. You withdraw, you pick fights, you disappear. And then when it's gone, you say it just wasn't meant to be. You tell yourself the timing was wrong, that they didn't understand you, that if it were truly right, it wouldn't have felt so uncomfortable. But what if the discomfort wasn't a sign of something wrong? What if it was the result of your own sabotage? What if the problem isn't the people you meet, or the things that fall apart, but the part of you that quietly believes you're not meant to be okay? There's a strange comfort in suffering you've chosen, a kind of safety in confirming your own worst expectations. If you destroy something good, at least you were in control. At least you didn't have to wait for it to leave on its own. But that control comes at a cost. You miss out, over and over again. You deny yourself the very things you claim to want, and eventually you don't even know what wanting feels like anymore. Just a dull ache, a quiet resentment, a vague, nameless sadness that follows you around no matter where you go. People think self-sabotage is dramatic, obvious, but it's usually subtle, invisible. You say the wrong thing at just the wrong moment. You send the text too late. You pretend you don't care when you do. You let your guard down just enough to prove it was a mistake, then use that as proof you were right to keep it up. And even when someone sees through it, even when they stay and try to understand, you find new ways to push them away. You test their patience. You ask for proof again and again until they get tired. And when they finally walk away, you feel abandoned, but relieved. You don't have to fight your own instinct anymore. You can return to the loneliness you've made feel like home. But that loneliness isn't neutral. It corrodes you. It wears you down. And eventually, it becomes part of your identity. You tell yourself you prefer it, that you're independent, strong, better off alone. But beneath that is something harder to admit, the fear that you couldn't hold on to happiness even if you tried. You've rehearsed failure so many times that success feels foreign enough to ruin. You see someone care for you and you question their motives. You get an opportunity and you convince yourself it's a trap. You start to feel peace and your mind invents danger just to make the stillness feel more familiar. Because peace isn't familiar. Not really. Not if you've spent most of your life bracing for impact. Stillness feels like the moment before the storm. Happiness feels like a setup. Kindness feels like a trick. And so you sabotage. Not because you want to suffer, but because suffering feels safer than hope. At least pain makes sense. At least it's predictable. But the truth underneath all of it is this. You do want what you're pushing away. You crave it deeply. You just don't trust yourself to keep it. You're afraid that if you get it and lose it, the pain will be worse than never having had it at all. So you cut the loss early, before it becomes unbearable. And you call that strength. You call it realism. But it's just fear in disguise. The things you need most, closeness, understanding, safety, are the things you are most prepared to destroy. Not because you're broken, but because, somewhere along the way, you learned that needing anything was dangerous. And now you live with the quiet, cruel burden of that lesson. One you never asked for, one you can't seem to unlearn. You're in the grocery store again. You don't need anything, you're just there. Walking slowly, pretending to browse, you glance at the same shelf twice, then take out your phone to check nothing in particular. There's no one around you, but you still stand up straighter, adjust your expression, tilt your body slightly, as if someone were watching, not someone you know. Just someone. This happens everywhere. In the hallway at work, in the bathroom mirror, on the street when you pass a dark window. 100 tiny performances for people who aren't watching and never were. You don't plan it, you don't even notice it most of the time. But the second you sense the idea of an audience, even an invisible one, you change. Your posture, your pace, your thoughts. You begin performing, not dramatically, just enough to appear better, sharper, more composed, as if some hidden observer might be grading your existence. And the strange part is, no one told you to do this. No one asked you to care. You just do. Almost automatically. Why? Maybe it began with real watchers, parents, teachers, friends, people who rewarded you when you smiled at the right time, or sat up straight, or didn't cry too loudly. Maybe it grew from there, from years of learning to manage impressions, to shape perception, to be palatable, agreeable, harmless, until the real people were no longer needed. Just the idea of them was enough. The imagined audience took over. Now, even alone, you perform, not always outwardly. Sometimes it's internal, thinking thoughts that make you seem kind, catching cruel impulses and replacing them with more acceptable ones. Rehearsing arguments you'll never have, telling stories in your head the way you'd tell them out loud, funny, self-aware, modest but not insecure. And none of it is for you. You're not the one watching. You're the one being watched. But by whom? It's not clear. Sometimes it's someone specific. An ex, a stranger from the internet, a friend you haven't seen in years. Sometimes it's a general blur, like the shape of an expectation you're trying to fit inside. Most of the time, it's no one at all, just the shadow of judgment. And that's where it becomes stranger, because you begin making choices not for how they feel, but for how they'll look. You avoid things that might appear embarrassing, even if they matter to you. You speak carefully, edit your sentences in real time. Avoid laughing too loudly, crying too easily, failing too visibly. Not because anyone is watching, but because it would be unbearable if they were. It doesn't stop there. You start remembering your life in the way it would be retold. You reframe pain so it sounds noble. You repackage regret as growth. You look back on old failures and narrate them like you've made peace, even when you haven't. You're not living your life, you're curating it. Not on social media, not just in public, but in your own head. Even your silence is performative. Even your privacy is shaped by invisible judgment. You become two people, the one who lives, and the one who watches the living. And the watcher's always just a little disappointed. They notice when you eat too much, when you stay in bed too long, when you give up early or try too hard. They notice every weakness, every small vanity, every moment that doesn't align with the version of you you're trying to project. They keep track, quietly, relentlessly. And here's the worst part. You've internalized them so deeply that you can't separate them from yourself. You think the voice is yours. You think the performance is you. And maybe now you're wondering what life would feel like without it. Without the constant self-monitoring. Without the constant shaping, just being. Acting without imagining how it looks. Living without folding yourself into someone else's expectations. But then, would you know who you are? Would you trust yourself? Or have you performed for so long that the performance has become the person. And if the audience has always been imaginary, then who have you been trying to impress all this time? What happens when you realize there's no one in the seats? What happens when you understand you've spent your life performing for people who were never watching and never cared? And what happens if you stop? Would the silence be peaceful or unbearable? What if the life you mourn most is the one you never actually lived? Not someone who died, not someone who left, but someone you never became. A version of yourself that existed only in possibility and then disappeared. It doesn't happen all at once. It begins quietly, a job you don't take, a relationship you leave, a risk you avoid. At first, they feel like ordinary choices, small, forgettable. But each one closes a door. Each one leaves behind a self that will now never exist. Sometimes you catch glimpses of them, in moments of silence, when you're tired, when you're alone. In the corner of your mind, a shadow of who you might have been. Not just a different career or lifestyle, a different way of thinking, of seeing, of feeling the world, and you feel something strange, not regret. Exactly, but a kind of grief, as if you lost someone, and you're not sure when it happened. Most people think grief belongs only to death, that mourning is reserved for things that are real. But some losses happen inside you, quietly, privately, without witnesses, and they can be just as heavy. You remember what you once wanted, what you once believed you could become. Maybe you wanted to be brave, or wild, or free. Maybe you imagined yourself in another place, another life. And now, years later, you can't find your way back to that version of yourself. And no one noticed but you. You try to dismiss it. Tell yourself everyone has dreams they didn't follow, that this is just part of growing up, that it's silly to grieve something that was never real. But the ache doesn't go away. It just changes shape. It becomes a quiet sadness you carry, without words. Sometimes you try to find them again, that lost self. You make changes. You start over. You chase something that feels close to what you once imagined. But it's never quite right, because the version of you that imagined it doesn't exist anymore either. You're not the same person who dreamed those dreams, and they're not waiting for you. They're just gone. You start to realize how much of your life has been shaped, not just by what you did, but by what you didn't. Not just by who you are, but by who you might have been. You see that your identity is made of absences, gaps, silences, possibilities that collapsed before they could form. And the strangest part is how real it all feels. How vividly you remember the life you never lived, the way it smells, the way it moves, the people in it, the way you might have laughed, or cried, or loved. It's like remembering a dream so clearly that you can't believe it didn't happen. But it didn't, and it never will. Some people try to fill that space with nostalgia, others with distractions. Some just bury it, pretend it's not there, but it always returns. Late at night, in quiet rooms, in moments of stillness when you're not performing for anyone. The ache of an unlived life, a self that was possible, but not chosen. And here's the part no one tells you. Every new choice creates another one. Every path you take means infinite. Others you don't. And every one of them leaves behind another version of you, flickering and fading just out of reach. It's not just one life you didn't live. It's hundreds, thousands. Each one as vivid, as detailed, as real as the one you're in. And all of them gone. You carry them inside you, sometimes with longing, sometimes with guilt, sometimes with nothing but a dull, heavy silence. You try to convince yourself you made the right choices, that there's no point in mourning a fantasy, that this, your real life, is what matters. But that doesn't make the grief go away, because it's not about wishing for another life. It's about recognizing that you contain more than one, that there are parts of you that will never be seen, never be lived, never be known, and you miss them, even if you don't understand them. That's the quiet cruelty of being human. You only get one life, but you carry the weight of countless others. And sometimes, in the stillness, you find yourself mourning someone no one else knew existed. A version of you that was almost real and always out of reach. What if you never fixed it? Not because you couldn't, but because it felt too familiar to let go. There's a chair in your home, broken slightly, just a loose leg. You know it wobbles, you know how to fix it, but you don't. Every time it tips under your weight, you just adjust. You move differently, more carefully. You've memorized the floor, so well it no longer feels like one. It's easy to say it's laziness or forgetfulness. But what if it's deeper than that? What if the wobble became part of the chair's identity and part of yours? What if fixing it felt like erasing something you've adapted to, something you've lived with so long, it started to feel natural? This happens more than we notice. A light flickers for months and we stop seeing it. A drawer jams and we learn the perfect angle to open it. We don't fix these things, we adjust ourselves instead. Slowly, subtly. We bend around the broken parts. Now imagine this same pattern in your relationships. There's someone you talk to every day. They dismiss you. They drain you. They've always done that. You feel it. Every time. But instead of pulling away, instead of saying anything, you explain it to yourself. You rationalize. You call it normal. You call it love. And every day you adapt a little more. Or think about the way you speak to yourself. Maybe you criticize your every mistake. You replay your failures, quietly, constantly. It hurts, but it's familiar. You've always done this. It doesn't even feel cruel anymore. It just feels like you. That's the danger. Because once something becomes familiar, it becomes harder to question, harder to imagine it any other way. The discomfort stops registering. The pain folds into routine. You convince yourself that it's manageable, that it's fine, that this is just who you are. And so nothing changes. You start to prefer the broken version of things, not because it's better, but because it's known, predictable, safe. The idea of fixing it feels like a risk, not a relief, even when it's hurting you, even when it's holding you back. You cling to it because it feels like home. There's comfort in that kind of pain, not because it soothes you, but because it doesn't surprise you. It doesn't challenge you. You already know how to live with it. Sometimes you'll catch yourself thinking about change. Maybe you imagine what life would be like if that relationship ended, or if you finally said something, or if you stopped punishing yourself for every mistake. And that vision is clear, but also disorienting. It feels like stepping into a new room, where the furniture isn't where it used to be. You worry you won't know how to move. You worry you'll lose something important, even if that something is the feeling of being stuck. So you stay. You keep the broken chair. You keep the flickering light. You keep the patterns you know, even when they're hurting you. You choose the pain that fits over the possibility that doesn't. And this isn't weakness. It's not stupidity. It's how the brain protects itself. Familiarity feels like safety, and safety feels like truth. But here's where it turns. What if the parts of your life that feel most you are actually just unexamined habits of harm? What if the traits you think define you, your overthinking, your self-blame, your constant accommodating, aren't personality traits at all, but survival strategies? What if you're not naturally anxious, just accustomed to walking on eggshells? What if you're not bad at boundaries, just practiced at pleasing? What if you're not unlovable, just used to being treated like you are? And if that's true, what would happen if you fixed it? Not just the chair, not just the light, but the part of you that settled into brokenness and called it familiar. What would happen if you finally changed the pattern? Maybe the reason you haven't isn't because you don't know how. Maybe it's because, on some deep, quiet level, you're afraid of who you'd be without it. Maybe the version of you that doesn't tolerate dysfunction is a stranger. Maybe you've lived so long with the ache that healing feels like loss. Because letting go of familiar pain means letting go of the identity you built around it. And that's a kind of grief too. So the broken things stay, not because they can't be fixed, but because somewhere along the way you learned to live with them, and then to need them, and then to believe they were you. And you never asked what it might cost to keep them, only what it might cost to let them go. Imagine you're walking down a quiet street, just past dusk, no one around, no traffic, no noise. You approach a crosswalk. The red light blinks steadily. You pause, and you wait, not because it's dangerous. There are no cars for miles, but still, you stand there, waiting, because something feels off about walking when the sign says not to. And then, without even realizing it, your eyes scan the windows, just to see if anyone might be watching. You don't think of yourself as someone who cares what others think. You believe in doing the right thing regardless of who's looking. But you wait. And if someone were watching, you'd feel a little prouder for obeying the sign. And if no one were, maybe you'd feel a little embarrassed by your own restraint. You weren't in danger. You weren't stopping traffic. But still, you waited. Why? You might think this is just manners or socialization. Maybe it's about fear of judgment or pride in being seen as good. But there's something stranger underneath. Because the truth is, we act differently when we're being watched. Not just a little, not just occasionally. Fundamentally, consistently, predictably. Even when the watcher isn't real. People donate more to charity when there's a poster of eyes above the collection box. Students cheat less when there's a mirror nearby. We speak more politely. We give more generously. We follow rules more closely, all when we believe we're being observed. The presence of a stranger, a camera, a reflective surface. Even just the suggestion of a gaze changes what we do. This isn't about surveillance, it's about exposure, about the fear of being known too deeply. Because when you're seen, really seen, you're forced to reconcile your private self with your public self. And most people live with a gap between the two. One version designed to be shown, another hidden, protected, withheld. So when we feel watched, we edit. We suppress the urge to cut corners. We smile when we don't mean it. We make different choices. Not always better, not always worse, but different, often kinder. More restrained, more careful. But here's the problem. If kindness depends on being seen, is it really kindness? If morality is stronger when observed, what does that say about our private selves? You'd like to think that you're good, even when no one's looking. But are you? Or do you simply become good when you believe someone might be judging? Imagine every private decision you've made, every small act when no one was around. Do those choices match the ones you make in public? Do you cut the same corners? Show the same patience? Do you help when there's no credit, no praise, no witness? Now imagine something else. Imagine that from the moment you were born, you were watched, constantly, not just by people, but by something deeper. Something that saw not just your actions, but your motives, your hesitations, your justifications. Imagine you lived your entire life under the gaze of something you couldn't fool. How would you change? Would you be better? Or just more careful? Would your kindness become more honest? Or more performative? Would you become more moral? Or would you simply get better at looking moral? And now reverse it. Imagine you were never watched. Not once. No consequences. No expectations. Just you. Alone. Unknown. Free. Would you still choose to do the right thing, or would something slip? Would your standards quietly erode? Would you become someone different, someone more selfish, more careless, more true, or more dangerous? Most people don't know the answer, because we almost never live without being seen. From the moment we enter school, we're graded, monitored, evaluated, and eventually we start to internalize the gaze. We start watching ourselves, judging ourselves, performing, even in solitude, as though the eyes never left. But deep down, you remember what it feels like to be truly alone, to make a decision that no one will ever know about, to choose not between good and bad, but between what you want and what you believe you should want. And in those moments, when the world forgets you exist, what do you become? If you're honest, the answer is unsettling, because the impulse to be kind when observed doesn't reveal our moral strength. It reveals its fragility. It shows how much of our goodness is borrowed from fear, from culture, from expectation, how little is truly our own. You think you're consistent. You think your values run deep, but the truth is more complicated, because in the absence of witnesses, your values begin to shift, not drastically, just enough to notice, just enough to reveal that part of your morality was never truly yours. And now you're forced to ask, who are you when no one's looking? Not just when no one is watching, but when no one ever could. If every action were erased, if every judgment were silenced, if your life played out in total secrecy, what kind of person would emerge? Would you be better than you think, or worse? The most disturbing part isn't discovering what others see in you. It's discovering what disappears the moment their eyes turn away. Imagine someone offers to help you, but asks for nothing in return. No favor, no payment, no recognition, just help, freely given. How long before you start to feel suspicious? It's strange, isn't it? How quickly we start to question kindness when it comes without a price. We're taught to be grateful, to accept generosity with open hands. But deep down, something else stirs. A quiet discomfort. An unease we don't talk about. Maybe it starts with a simple thought. Why? Why would someone do this for me? Why go out of their way, offer their time, their energy, their resources, without getting anything back? You want to believe it's goodness, altruism. But another voice whispers, nobody gives something for nothing. So you start to search. You look for the catch. You wonder if there's something hidden, a cost you just haven't seen yet. Maybe they want control. Maybe they want you to feel indebted. Maybe this isn't generosity. It's a trap. And once you accept the help, you'll owe them, quietly, permanently. We don't like being in someone's debt, even when the debt is invisible, even when the person insists there is none. Something inside us resists. It feels like being owned, like part of our freedom has been quietly taken. And maybe that's what we fear most, not the help itself, but the vulnerability it creates. Because to accept help is to expose a need. It's to admit weakness, to let someone else see where you're lacking. And when that help comes without cost, without condition, there's nothing to hide behind. No exchange to protect your pride. No transaction to balance the scales. You're just receiving. And somehow that feels worse. We live in a world where everything has a price. Nothing is truly free. Every action, every favor, every kindness is assumed to come with terms. So when someone steps outside that logic, we don't feel relieved, we feel confused, disoriented, and slowly distrustful. Think about how you react to unsolicited generosity. A stranger pays for your coffee. A neighbor offers to fix your fence. A co-worker covers your shift. No questions asked. You smile. You thank them. But later, when you're alone, your mind turns. Why would they do that? What do they want? Are they trying to make me look weak? Will they bring this up later? Use it against me? Expect something I can't give? Even when help is small, harmless, it rarely feels clean. The moment we accept it, we start preparing to repay. Not because they asked, but because we can't bear the imbalance. We don't want to feel beholden. We don't want to owe. And if they truly expect nothing, that only deepens the discomfort. Because now you're left with the weight of their gift, and no way to return it, no way to reset the scale. So it just hangs there, quietly. A reminder that someone gave more than you did, that someone showed care, and you didn't deserve it. This is where the suspicion grows, not just of others, but of ourselves. What does it say about you, that you can't accept kindness without suspicion? What does it say about the way you view people, and motives, and love? You might try to justify it. Say it's wisdom, that you've been burned before, that you know how the world works, that naivete is dangerous. But beneath all that is something colder, the belief that people only care when they benefit. That empathy is just another form of strategy. That behind every generous act is a hidden ledger tracking every favor, every credit, every unspoken cost. And when someone breaks that logic, when they offer help with no ledger, no conditions, no price, you don't feel safe, you feel exposed. Because now there's nothing to protect you from the possibility that they're real, that someone might actually care. And if that's true, you're left with a harder truth, that you don't know how to accept care. That somewhere along the way, you learned to see love itself as suspicious. Maybe this is why we trust people more when they ask for something in return. A favor for a favor, a ride for gas money, a meal for company. It feels more honest, more predictable. It puts both people on even ground, but true help that asks nothing feels uneven. It makes one person strong, the other weak. One person giving, the other receiving. And even when it's done in kindness, the imbalance echoes. It lingers. Now ask yourself something harder. If you gave help, would you really expect nothing back? Not thanks, not recognition, not even the quiet knowledge that they think better of you. Or would you be waiting, deep down, for your kindness to be noticed, remembered, returned someday? Maybe that's why we doubt help that comes without cost, because we know we couldn't offer it ourselves. Not truly, not completely. We understand the hidden strings because we tie them too. And in that reflection, something breaks. Not in others, in you. Because it's not that you don't trust their motives, it's that you've never learned to trust kindness itself. Imagine someone you used to know, a classmate, a colleague, a friend, reaches out after years of silence. They've changed. Something about them is different, not just their appearance, but the way they speak, what they believe, how they behave. And even if that change seems positive, you feel it immediately, a quiet, stubborn discomfort. You smile, but you don't trust them anymore, not because they hurt you, not because they lied, but because they're not the same. At first it doesn't make sense. We're told that growth is good, change is natural, that we're all supposed to evolve. But when someone actually does, when their views shift, when their personality transforms, when they leave behind who they used to be, we pull back, not always visibly, not always consciously. But something inside us closes. We feel uneasy, guarded, distant. It's subtle. You might say nothing. You might even say you're proud of them. But part of you starts watching them more closely, looking for cracks, waiting for them to slip. Because something in your brain no longer believes what they're showing you. You see the smile, but it feels rehearsed. You hear their words, but they don't land the same. You can't explain it exactly, but they feel untrustworthy. This isn't about betrayal or deception. This is about the discomfort we feel when someone breaks the continuity of who they were. We form mental models of people, rigid, simplified versions of who they are, what they believe, how they act. And when they change, those models break. We lose the script. We no longer know how to predict them. And without predictability, we feel unsafe. So we default to suspicion. We start asking ourselves, who are they really? If they could become this version of themselves, what else might they become? If they left behind the values we once shared, what values do they truly hold? If they changed once, what stops them from changing again? But then it gets darker. We don't just distrust them, we start to resent them. Their change becomes an accusation, a silent judgment on the version of themselves we still remember. And by extension, a judgment on us. Because if they've changed and grown, what does that say about us for staying the same? If they now reject beliefs we still hold, does that make us wrong? If they abandoned habits we still cling to, does that make us weak? Their transformation threatens our stability. Their new identity puts pressure on ours, so we defend ourselves by undermining them. Quietly, often unconsciously. We question their sincerity. We call them fake, pretentious, arrogant. We remember how they used to be, and use that as proof that the new version can't be real. We find comfort in their past flaws because it gives us permission to doubt their present. But the contradiction is hard to ignore. We claim to value growth, but only when it's slow, familiar, comfortable. When it aligns with our expectations. When it doesn't challenge our self-image, we say people can change, but when they actually do, we often hold it against them. Think of how often we demand apologies, transformations, accountability. Yet, when someone offers it, when they genuinely try to become better, we don't fully accept it. We bring up their past. We dig into old mistakes. We question their motives, as if their effort to change makes them more suspicious, not less. Why? Maybe because their change reminds us of our own stagnation, or because it reminds us how fragile our identity really is. How easily it can be rewritten, reconstructed, replaced, and that scares us. Because if they can change so completely, what's stopping us from doing the same? What if the version of ourselves we're holding on to so tightly isn't permanent, or necessary, or even real? So we push back. Not to hurt them, but to protect ourselves. But now imagine the roles reversed. Imagine you've changed, grown, softened, or hardened. You've left behind who you were because you had to, because something cracked, or opened, or broke. You're proud of who you are now. But when you return to the people who once knew you, they don't welcome you back. They watch you. They smile politely, but you feel it. The distance, the suspicion, the doubt. You tell yourself, it's fine, that they'll come around, but they don't. They never really trust the new you. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you're no longer predictable. And now the discomfort isn't abstract anymore. Now it's yours. Now you understand the weight of being seen, not for who you are, but for who you used to be. And there's no way to prove you've changed. Not really, not to someone who's already decided they liked the old version better. So you carry that quiet loneliness. The knowledge that to grow is to risk being left behind by those who can't let go of who you were. That no matter how much better you become, it might never be enough to undo the suspicion your change creates. And maybe the hardest part is realizing that you would have done the same. That if the roles were reversed, you might not have trusted them either. Why do you stay? Not in the room, not in the job, not even in the relationship. In the feeling, the heaviness, the ache, the quiet, familiar pain. You've left people, you've moved cities, you've changed everything, but the feeling followed, or maybe you followed it. Maybe you never really tried to leave at all. There's a kind of pain that doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention. It just waits. Woven into your days like background noise, you've stopped noticing, but you build your life around it. Your choices, your habits, the way you speak, the way you love, all shaped around a discomfort that's always been there. It isn't dramatic. It isn't trauma you talk about. It's subtle, deep, like a muscle you don't remember pulling, but one you never let heal. You say you want peace, relief, a life that feels easy, but then you sabotage it. You destroy good things. You turn away from people who are kind to you. You grow restless when things are calm. And in moments of happiness, something inside you recoils, like it doesn't belong, like it's waiting for something to go wrong. Maybe you've confused safety with danger. Maybe comfort feels unfamiliar, and pain feels like home. It makes no sense, but then again, it makes all the sense in the world. Some part of you believes that if things aren't hard, they aren't real, that ease is fake, and suffering is honest. You've learned to trust the ache, to measure the truth of your life by how much it hurts. When things go well, you get suspicious. You wait for the betrayal, the failure, the fall, and if it doesn't come, you create it. Quietly, almost lovingly. It isn't that you want to suffer, it's that you don't know who you are without it. If you've always been anxious, calm feels boring. If you've always been blamed, kindness feels manipulative. If you've always been unloved, affection feels threatening. So you return to what feels right, even if it's wrong. And the mind is clever. It finds explanations, justifications. It tells you why things had to end, why people couldn't be trusted, why nothing good lasts. But underneath the stories, there's a deeper pattern, one you're scared to name. You need the pain because it proves something. It proves you're trying, that you care, that you're not numb, that you're still alive. And somewhere in you, there's a rule: if you're not hurting, you're not doing enough. If you're not exhausted, you're not trying hard enough. If it doesn't hurt, it doesn't count. So you choose the harder path, the unstable job, the emotionally distant partner, the impossible schedule. You take on burdens you don't need. You solve problems that aren't yours. You stay up late, worrying about things you can't fix. Not because you have to, but because it feels right, because struggle has become your compass. And anything that doesn't demand suffering feels unearned, feels undeserved. Maybe you were praised for being strong, for being the one who could handle it. And now you can't stop proving it. You can't stop performing your resilience. Even when no one's watching. Even when it's killing you. Sometimes when things get better, you don't feel relief. You feel disoriented. Like something is missing. And so you pick a fight. You delay the good news. You punish yourself quietly. You find a way back to the pain, because without it you don't know what to hold on to. And then you tell yourself you're broken, that you must have some deep flaw, some hidden damage. But maybe it's not about damage. Maybe it's about familiarity, about survival, about patterns learned so early they feel like truth. Maybe you don't need to heal the pain before you leave it. Maybe you just need to stop obeying it. But you don't, not yet, because you still believe the pain is protecting you, that it's keeping you honest, that it's keeping you safe, and so you stay. In the stress, the tension, the low-level dread that hums beneath your thoughts. You stay not because it's good, but because it's yours. Because without it, you don't know who you'd be. And maybe that's the scariest part. Not the pain itself, but the silence that would come if you ever let it go. Imagine you're in pain. Real pain, not just emotional, but deep, formative, unforgettable. A kind of pain that doesn't fade with time, but instead shapes how you walk through the world. Maybe it came from someone close to you, a betrayal, a dismissal. a humiliation that taught you, quietly, not just what to feel, but what to expect. Now imagine that years later, without thinking, you find yourself in a situation that feels eerily familiar. Different people, different context, but the same dynamic, the same feeling. And instead of running from it, you lean in. You replicate the same scenario. Not because you want to suffer again, but because this time you want to be in control. You repeat the wound so you can direct it, manage it, redefine it. Maybe now you get to be the one who walks away, or the one who doesn't beg, or the one who gets the apology. It feels like healing, but it isn't. It's reenactment, a loop, a rehearsal of trauma disguised as empowerment. This is how people return to relationships that mirror the ones that broke them. It's how a child raised by a critical parent grows into an adult who only feels understood by someone who disapproves of them. It's how rejection becomes strangely comforting, because at least it's familiar. At least it makes sense. And when something feels familiar, it feels safer than the unknown. Even when the unknown might be healthier. Even when the unknown might be love. There's a kind of safety in pain you've already lived through. You survived it once, so your mind tells you you'll survive it again. But joy, vulnerability, acceptance, those are dangerous. They can be taken away, so your mind pulls you back toward the pain it understands, because understanding feels like control. That's the trap. People assume we chase what we desire, but often we chase what we recognize. What we've already known. We mistake familiarity for truth. We call it intuition, chemistry, fate. But it's often just a reenactment of old pain, wearing a different face. And the worst part is, it doesn't feel like self-harm. It feels like self-protection, like you're getting another chance to do it right, to finally win the battle you lost years ago. But the terms haven't changed. The battlefield is just more subtle, and you're still fighting ghosts. You might tell yourself that this time you'll keep the upper hand, that this time you'll see it coming. But patterns aren't broken by seeing them. They're broken by stepping outside them, and that often means feeling lost, vulnerable, uncertain, which is exactly what the old pattern protected you from. That's why it's so hard to let go. Not because the pattern is enjoyable, but because it's predictable. And the mind loves what it can predict, even if it costs you peace. People recreate the dynamics that broke them, not because they're weak, but because it feels like the only way to stop being afraid. If you can control the pain, you don't have to be surprised by it. If you can cause it or predict it, you don't have to feel helpless again. But all it does is deepen the original wound. It reinforces the idea that love must hurt, that connection must come with conditions, that trust is always a risk not worth taking. So the cycle continues until something breaks, not in you, but around you. A relationship ends, a job falls apart, a belief stops holding, and suddenly the pattern is exposed. You see how many times you've walked the same path, hoping the ending would change. You see how control was never the solution, just a distraction from the fear. And if you're lucky or just tired enough, you begin to wonder what would it feel like to stop repeating it, to choose uncertainty over control, to face the pain, not by reenacting it, but by grieving it. There's no clear answer, no dramatic moment of healing. Just a quiet shift, a decision to not text the person who reminds you of the one who hurt you, a refusal to chase approval that was never freely given, a pause where there used to be panic, and slowly the pattern weakens, not because the pain goes away, but because you stop trying to master it. You stop trying to win at something that was never your fault. That's when you realize the truth. You weren't repeating the pain to feel better. You were repeating it to feel less powerless. But healing doesn't come from mastering the past. It comes from no longer needing to, and that means learning to sit in the silence of what you can't control. The uncertainty of people who don't fit your pattern. The discomfort of not knowing what comes next. It's quieter there, less dramatic, but also less cruel. And maybe that's the real freedom. Not changing what hurt you, but no longer needing to. Imagine someone touches a part of you you've spent years guarding, not physically, but emotionally. They see through the noise. They see the pain before you speak it. They reach in and ease it too fast. You should feel grateful, relieved. But instead, something tightens inside you. Something recoils. There's a moment, small but real, when their kindness doesn't feel safe. It feels invasive, like they've skipped steps, like they've stolen something from you, even if you don't know what it is yet. This is what happens when someone heals you too quickly. It's not that you want to stay broken, but you've learned to survive inside the wound. You've made sense of life around it. Maybe you've built your identity on it, or maybe you've just learned to manage the weight of it, minute by minute. When someone reaches in and lifts it without warning, your body doesn't register relief. It registers danger. Something's been moved. Something's been exposed. They see a pain you haven't even admitted to yourself, and instead of easing you toward it, they confront it head on. No ceremony, just sudden clarity, the kind that leaves you breathless, disoriented. And now you're left standing in front of yourself with nowhere to hide. It should feel like a gift, but it doesn't. It feels like trespassing, like someone opened a door you'd locked for a reason. And so you pull away, you distance yourself. You tell yourself it's not a good fit, or that they're too intense, too much. You create space, not because you dislike them, but because they got too close too fast. Because you weren't ready. And here's the strange part. You might not even realize what's happening. You just feel a kind of discomfort around them, a kind of tension you can't explain. You don't hate them. In fact, you admire them. But something in you shuts down around them, almost automatically. It's not rejection, it's defense. Because healing isn't just about removing pain. It's about timing, about trust, about control. When someone rushes the process, even out of love, it can feel like they've robbed you of something sacred. The slow unfolding, the permission, the right to arrive at healing on your own terms. And if you've spent most of your life holding your pain carefully, protecting it from being mishandled or dismissed, then even the gentlest form of sudden healing can feel like a violation. So instead of moving toward the person, you move away, not because they did something wrong, but because they did something too right. And that's hard to admit, because it doesn't make sense, logically. Why would you resist someone who brings you peace? Why would you avoid someone who offers understanding, presence, care? But healing isn't logical. It's layered in fear, in history, in memory. Maybe you've been hurt by people who tried to fix you too soon. People who used your pain to feel powerful, or people who saw your healing as a way to earn your love. Maybe being understood became a currency. Others tried to spend too quickly. So now, even when the intentions are pure, the response is the same. Distance, avoidance, silence. It's a pattern that looks like self-sabotage, but it's not. It's protection. You're not running from the person. You're running from the speed. You need space to understand the healing. You need slowness to build trust. You need control over how the wound is approached. And most of all, you need to believe that the healing is yours, that it came from within you, not from someone else's sudden gift. Because no matter how generous they are, no matter how kind, healing that arrives too fast can feel like an injury of its own. A wound created by the absence of preparation. And so you avoid the person who offers it. Not because they're wrong for you, but but because they saw too much, too quickly, and for a moment you felt like you disappeared. Imagine doing something cruel, not for gain, not for revenge, just so someone will finally look at you. Maybe you humiliate a coworker in front of others. Maybe you betray a friend's secret at the worst possible moment. Maybe you mock someone weaker, someone struggling, and you see them wince, but you keep going. And when it's over, when the silence falls, there's this strange feeling, not guilt, not quite satisfaction, something else, something like relief. Because for once, you were noticed. That's the part no one wants to admit. That sometimes hurting someone else feels like proof that you're real. It isn't always loud or violent. Sometimes it's subtle, an interruption, a sneer, a withheld compliment, a carefully timed silence that ruins someone's moment. You know the right thing to do, you know how to be kind, but something inside chooses not to. Not because you hate the person, but because kindness would leave you invisible. You weren't born this way, you learned it. Slowly, quietly. Maybe you spent years doing everything right, being good, generous, supportive, and no one noticed. Or if they did, they forgot. But when you snapped, when you made someone feel small, you were remembered. You became the center of attention. If only for a second, you mattered. It doesn't feel like power, it feels like being less invisible, like clawing your way back into someone else's awareness, even if the price is cruelty, and that's the trap. Because once you see that hurting others can make you feel seen, it's hard to unsee it. The pattern starts repeating. You interrupt more, you undermine, you provoke. Not to destroy someone, but to be acknowledged. You don't want to be feared or hated. You just want to be real in someone else's mind. But of course, you tell yourself a different story. You say the other person deserved it. You say you were just being honest. You say they needed to be put in their place. These are the justifications you whisper to yourself afterward, little shields against the truth. And the truth is this: you felt powerless. And then for a moment you didn't. Most people have no idea they're doing it. They think they're standing up for themselves, asserting boundaries, protecting their dignity. But really, they're reaching out in the only way they think will be felt, through pain. Because if kindness is ignored and cruelty is remembered, then cruelty becomes a kind of proof. And you see this everywhere. Children lashing out in class, not to disrupt, but to be seen. Partners picking fights, not out of hate, but desperation to be felt. Friends mocking each other because it's safer to wound than to be vulnerable. Cruelty as a cry for visibility. But what no one tells you is how it backfires. Slowly, predictably. The more you hurt others to be noticed, the more you become the person others learn to look away from. They might remember you, but not the way you wanted. They remember the sting, the wound, the damage, and they step back. You don't get closeness, you don't get love, you get distance, avoidance, fear, and you confuse that for power. You tell yourself you've won, but what you've won is isolation. And somewhere in the middle of that is a terrible realization. You're not just hurting others, you're training them to see you as dangerous. You're building a world where the only way to matter is to harm. And then you're trapped, because if you stop, you disappear. If you continue, you're feared. And if you try to be gentle again, no one believes it. This is what we rarely admit, that we sometimes turn to cruelty, not because we want to destroy, but because we want to destroy, but because we're desperate not to disappear. And that desperation has a cost, not just to the people we hurt, but to ourselves. Imagine entering a room where everything is calm, nothing is wrong, no danger, no noise, just silence, softness, and stillness. And yet, something feels off. Not because anything is happening, but because nothing is, no tension, no urgency. Just a kind of quiet that doesn't match what you're used to. It's supposed to feel good, but instead, it makes your skin crawl. You try to relax, but your body doesn't follow. You look for something, anything to do. A distraction, a sound, even a small problem to solve. Because the silence feels unbearable. Like you're waiting for something to go wrong. You can't explain it, but it feels safer when there's a little bit of chaos, a little bit of noise, something to fix, something to fight against. This isn't just preference, it's pattern. Something built over years of tension, disappointment, survival. When calm isn't familiar, it doesn't feel safe. When no one's angry, when nothing's urgent, when no one needs saving or explaining or avoiding, your mind doesn't settle. It searches for threat. It distrusts the quiet. It waits for the hit. It's sure is coming. So you start the fight yourself. You say something sharp. You provoke. You retreat. You scan for rejection. You feel yourself pulling back, sabotaging, disturbing what was peaceful. Not because you want conflict, but because it feels more normal than calm. You don't know what to do with peace, because you don't trust it. You never learned how. Peace, when unfamiliar, feels like danger. It confuses the nervous system. Something deep inside assumes that if nothing is wrong, then something must be hiding. You mistake stillness for suppression, safety for silence before the storm. You expect the twist, the betrayal, the loss, because that's how the story usually goes. So instead of waiting for the pain, you jump first. You create it. At least then you're in control, and that's the trap. You think you're defending yourself, but what you're really doing is recreating the past. Pulling yourself back into familiar pain, because unfamiliar peace is too threatening. You've mistaken dysfunction for normal. You've mistaken exhaustion for calm. You've mistaken numbness for peace. So when something gentle shows up, someone kind, something steady, you feel yourself tensing. You look for flaws. You imagine endings. You resist closeness, not because you don't want it, but because some part of you believes you can't have it. Or worse, that if you do, it will only hurt more when it's gone. You sabotage what's good to protect yourself from the possibility of loss. But in doing that, you guarantee the loss. This isn't irrational, it's learned. Somewhere along the line, you associated love with instability, presence with tension, attention with pressure. You never just got to relax. So your body learned that relaxing is dangerous. That calm means you're not ready. That rest means you'll be caught off guard. And so you remain alert. Even when there's nothing to fear. You destroy peace, not because you want chaos, but because peace doesn't feel like yours. It feels like it belongs to someone else. Someone who grew up safe. Someone who didn't have to watch everything all the time. Someone who could trust silence without flinching. And now, when peace shows up, you don't know how to hold it. You don't even recognize it. You wait for it to leave, or you make it leave first. That way, at least, you don't have to be surprised. You can say you were right, that nothing good ever stays. That calm is just the beginning of collapse. But here's the harder truth. It's not that peace is fake. It's that your body doesn't believe it yet. And until it does, you will keep pushing it away. You will keep returning to noise. You will keep creating crisis to feel grounded. You will keep hurting yourself just to feel real. You will keep destroying the thing you need most because it feels like a trick. And maybe you already know this. Maybe you've watched yourself ruin something good and felt sick with the knowledge that it was you. Maybe you've seen the moment peace arrived and you turned from it, not out of anger, but fear. Maybe the most terrifying thing isn't being hurt. It's being calm enough to feel what's underneath all the defenses, all the pretending, all the roles, because real peace isn't silence. It's presence, and presence means facing what you've been running from. And if that's unfamiliar, it won't feel like peace at all. It will feel like exposure. It will feel like danger. It will feel like you're standing still while everything inside you begs to run. And the cruel part is, you might run anyway. Even when you know better. Even when you see the pattern. Even when the peace is real.